Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Rachel Thompson had seen her share of crime scenes during her 7 years with the Phoenix Police Department. But nothing had prepared her for the pristine horror of 4432 Desert View Lane. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in July, a wellness check requested by concerned neighbors who hadn't seen their elderly neighbor, Harold Winters, in over a week. What Rachel found when she arrived would challenge everything she thought she knew about human nature and the capacity for evil. The house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood, its manicured lawn and well-maintained facade giving no hint of the nightmare contained within. Rachel's partner, Officer Mike Rodriguez, was already on scene, standing in the driveway with a pale expression that immediately put her on high alert. "What have we got?" she asked, stepping out of her patrol car into the oppressive desert heat. "Neighbor called it in," Mike replied, his voice tight. "Says she hasn't seen Harold in 8 days. Mails piling up, newspapers scattered on the driveway. Front door was unlocked." Rachel nodded, pulling on her latex gloves. "Any signs of forced entry?" "None. That's what's bothering me. Everything looks too perfect." They approached the front door together, their hands instinctively moving to their service weapons. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of dark interior. Rachel pushed it open with her elbow, careful not to contaminate any potential evidence. The smell hit her first. Not the overwhelming stench of decomposition she expected, but something else. Something clean and sterile, like disinfectant mixed with something metallic. The entryway was immaculate, not a speck of dust or a single item out of place. "Phoenix Police," Rachel called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Mr. Winters, this is Officer Thompson. We're here to check on you." No response. They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps muffled by thick carpeting. The living room was as pristine as the entryway, magazines arranged in perfect stacks, couch cushions fluffed and positioned just so, not a single fingerprint on the glass coffee table. "This is wrong," Mike whispered. "Nobody lives this clean." Rachel nodded, her unease growing. Harold Winters was 73 years old, a widower who lived alone. According to the neighbor, he was a bit of a hoarder, someone who kept newspapers and magazines for years, just in case. Yet the house looked like a showroom. They found Harold in his bedroom. He was lying on his back in the center of the bed, arms folded neatly across his chest, eyes closed as if he were sleeping peacefully. He was dressed in a clean white shirt and dark slacks, his gray hair combed perfectly, his face freshly shaven. If not for the complete absence of breathing, he might have been mistaken for someone taking an afternoon nap. "Jesus," Mike breathed, reaching for his radio. "We need the coroner and crime scene techs. Now." Rachel approached the bed slowly, her trained eye taking in every detail. No signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, no blood. The bedding was tucked around Harold's body with hospital corner precision, the pillows arranged symmetrically behind his head. "Look at this," she said, pointing to Harold's hands. "His fingernails are perfectly manicured. When was the last time you saw a 73-year-old man with fingernails that clean?" Mike moved to the other side of the bed, his expression grim. "And look at his skin. There's no discoloration, no signs of decomposition. How long did the neighbor say he'd been missing?" 8 days, Rachel replied. But even as she said it, she knew something was wrong. A body left in the Arizona heat for 8 days would be in advanced stages of decomposition. Harold looked like he died hours ago, not days. They were interrupted by the arrival of the crime scene team, led by forensics specialist Dr. Sarah Chen. Rachel had worked with Chen before, and respected her methodical approach to evidence collection. "What do we have?" Chen asked, setting down her equipment kit. "Possible homicide," Rachel replied. "Victim is Harold Winters, 73, found deceased in his bedroom. But there's something off about the whole scene." Chen pulled on her gloves and approached the bed. She spent several minutes examining Harold's body without touching it, her brow furrowing with concentration. "Has anyone moved the body?" she asked. "No," Mike replied. "We secured the scene as soon as we found him." Chen nodded and began taking photographs from every angle. "I need to take his temperature, but I can tell you right now that decomposition is not consistent with an 8-day timeline. This man died recently, maybe 12 to 18 hours ago." Rachel felt a chill despite the desert heat. "That's impossible. The neighbor saw him last Tuesday. Today is Wednesday. I'm telling you what the evidence shows," Chen said firmly. "Either the neighbor is lying, or someone has been keeping this body preserved somehow." The implications of that statement hung in the air like a threat. Rachel looked around the bedroom again, noting the same unnatural cleanliness she'd observed in the rest of the house. The dresser top was dust-free, the mirror spotless, the carpet showed no signs of foot traffic. "We need to process this entire house," she said. "Something is very wrong here." As the crime scene team worked, Rachel and Mike canvassed the neighborhood, talking to anyone who might have seen Harold in the past week. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Mrs. Elena Martinez, Harold's next-door neighbor, insisted she had seen him last Tuesday, taking in his mail around 3 p.m. She was certain because she remembered waving to him from her kitchen window. "He looked perfectly normal," she told them. "Maybe a little tired, but that's not unusual for a man his age." But Harold's other neighbor, James Patterson, told a different story. He claimed to have seen Harold on Sunday, 3 days after Mrs. Martinez's sighting, working in his garden in the early morning hours. "I thought it was odd," Patterson said. Harold never gardened at dawn. He was always more of a late-morning person. But there he was, around 6 a.m., perfectly dressed, working with his roses. Rachel made a note of the discrepancy. "How did he look? Did he seem okay?" "That's the thing," Patterson replied, his voice troubled. "He looked too okay, if that makes sense. Like he'd just stepped out of a barber shop. His hair was perfect, his clothes were spotless. He was even wearing dress shoes while gardening. The timeline was becoming increasingly confused." Rachel spoke with 5 different neighbors, and each gave a different date for their last sighting of Harold. The dates ranged from the previous Tuesday to as recently as Monday, just 2 days ago. "Either everyone in this neighborhood has a terrible memory," Mike said as they walked back to Harold's house, "or someone has been impersonating Harold Winters." Rachel nodded, but something else was bothering her. "Did you notice anything odd about the neighbors' descriptions?" "What do you mean?" "They all described Harold the same way, perfectly dressed, perfectly groomed, perfectly normal. But according to Mrs. Martinez, Harold had been declining lately. She said he'd been forgetting things, sometimes wore the same clothes for days, let his yard go. Yet everyone who saw him this week described him as immaculate." They returned to the house to find Chen finishing her preliminary examination. Her expression was grim. "I've got some initial findings," she said, pulling off her gloves. "The victim shows no signs of violence, no obvious cause of death. But there are some anomalies. Such as? His body has been cleaned recently, Someone washed him, dressed him, even trimmed his fingernails and toenails. The skin shows signs of preservation. Not natural decomposition retardation, but artificial preservation. Rachel felt her stomach turn. You mean someone embalmed him? Not exactly, but close. Someone with knowledge of mortuary science has been maintaining this body. The question is, when did he actually die? Chen led them to Harold's bathroom, where she had set up additional equipment. I found traces of embalming fluid in the drain. Someone has been using this bathroom as a makeshift mortuary. The bathroom was as pristine as the rest of the house, but now Rachel could see the signs. The shower had been scrubbed with industrial-strength cleaners. The mirror was too clean. The grout between the tiles was bleached white. Whoever did this has been coming back, Chen continued. Multiple times. They've been maintaining the body, keeping it fresh, moving it around the house to create the illusion that Harold was still alive. But why? Mike asked. What's the point? Rachel was beginning to understand, and the realization made her skin crawl. They were buying time, creating witnesses who would swear Harold was alive days after he actually died. The perfect alibi. Chen nodded. That's my thinking too, but there's something else. I found this in the kitchen. She led them to the kitchen where she had bagged a small notebook found in a drawer. Through the evidence bag, Rachel could see pages of handwriting, neat, precise, almost mechanical in its uniformity. It's a schedule, Chen explained. Times and dates, specific instructions. 6 a.m., garden appearance, casual clothes, wave to Patterson. 3 p.m., mail retrieval, formal attire, acknowledge Martinez. Someone has been orchestrating Harold's appearances to create a detailed timeline of his supposed activities. Rachel felt a chill as she read the entries. The level of planning was extraordinary and terrifying. This isn't just a murder, she said. This is a psychological experiment. There's more, Chen said. I found a hidden camera in the living room. Professional grade, motion activated. Someone has been recording everything. The implications were staggering. Not only had someone murdered Harold Winters, but they had turned his death into an elaborate performance, using his corpse like a puppet to create the illusion of life. We need to find who had access to the house, Rachel said. Someone with a key, someone Harold trusted. They began going through Harold's personal effects, looking for any clue that might lead them to the killer. In his bedroom closet, they found a small address book filled with names and phone numbers. Most were family members or old friends, but one entry stood out. Dr. Marcus Webb, house calls, 5550147. Rachel called the number. It was answered on the second ring by a man with a calm, professional voice. Dr. Webb speaking. Dr. Webb, this is Officer Thompson with Phoenix PD. I understand you were providing medical care to Harold Winters. There was a pause. Yes, I was. Is Harold all right? I'm afraid Mr. Winters has passed away. We'd like to speak with you about his recent medical history. Another pause, longer this time. Of course, I can meet you at my office in an hour. Rachel hung up and turned to Mike. Something about that conversation felt off. He didn't seem surprised enough. Dr. Webb's office was in a small medical complex on the outskirts of Phoenix. The waiting room was empty, and Dr. Webb greeted them personally. A tall, thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and unnaturally steady hands. Please, sit down, he said, gesturing to chairs in his office. I'm shocked to hear about Harold. When did this happen? We're still determining that, Rachel said carefully. Can you tell us about your relationship with Mr. Winters? I've been his physician for about 6 months. He was having some health issues, heart problems, early stages of dementia. He preferred house calls because he didn't like leaving his home. When did you last see him? Dr. Webb consulted an appointment book on his desk. Last Tuesday. I went to check on him around 2 p.m. Rachel made a note. That was the same day Mrs. Martinez claimed to have seen Harold. How did he seem? Declining, unfortunately. His dementia was progressing faster than I'd hoped. He was becoming confused, agitated. I prescribed some medication to help with the anxiety. What kind of medication? Lorazepam, a mild sedative. Nothing dangerous in normal doses. Rachel exchanged glances with Mike. Dr. Webb, did Harold ever give you a key to his house? Yes, for emergencies. He was worried about falling and not being able to get to the door. Where is that key? Now? Dr. Webb's expression didn't change, but Rachel noticed his hands had become very still. It should be in my desk drawer. Let me check. He opened the drawer and fumbled around for a moment before looking up with a puzzled expression. That's strange. I can't seem to find it. When did you last see it? I'm not sure. I rarely needed to use it. Rachel's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but she kept her voice level. Doctor Webb, would you mind if we looked around your office? I'm afraid I can't allow that without a warrant. Patient confidentiality, you understand. Of course, but we appreciate your cooperation. As they left the office, Mike shook his head. That guy is hiding something. More than something, Rachel agreed. Did you notice his hands? They were rock steady until I asked about the key. Then they started shaking. They drove back to the station to begin the process of obtaining a search warrant for Dr. Webb's office. Rachel was filling out the paperwork when her phone rang. Officer Thompson? This is Dr. Chen. I've got some preliminary autopsy results that you need to hear. Go ahead. Harold Winters died of an overdose of lorazepam, the same medication Dr. Webb prescribed. But here's the interesting part. The drug was administered intravenously, not orally. Someone with medical knowledge killed him. Rachel felt the pieces clicking into place. How long ago? Based on the tissue samples and the preservation methods used, I'd estimate he died 9 days ago. But someone has been maintaining the body and moving it around to create the illusion of life. 9 days, Rachel repeated. That would be last Monday. There's something else. I found injection marks on his arm, consistent with repeated IV access. Someone has been using him as a test subject. The full horror of what had happened was beginning to dawn on Rachel. Dr. Webb hadn't just murdered Harold, he had been experimenting on him, using his death as some sort of twisted research project. We need that search warrant, she told Mike. Now. It took 3 hours to get the warrant, and by the time they returned to Dr. Webb's office, he was gone. But what they found in his office was enough to make Rachel's blood run cold. The back room had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. There were medical texts on preservation techniques, detailed notes on decomposition rates, and photographs, dozens of them, showing Harold's body in various states and positions throughout the week. Jesus Christ, Mike breathed, looking at the photos. He was posing the body. Rachel found a computer filled with video files. When she opened them, she saw footage from the hidden camera in Harold's house. Hours upon hours of Dr. Webb moving Harold's corpse around, positioning it in different rooms, even taking it outside to create the garden appearance that James Patterson had witnessed. This is sick, she said, scrolling through the files. He's been playing with the body like a doll. In a filing cabinet, they found the real horror. Detailed notes on what Dr. Webb called Project Lazarus. He had been studying the psychological effects of death on observers, trying to determine how long he could maintain the illusion of life using a corpse. Harold Winters hadn't just been murdered. He had been turned into a research subject in a demented experiment on the nature of life and death. "Look at this," Mike said, holding up a notebook filled with psychological profiles. He's been studying the neighbors, learning their routines, their schedules. He knew exactly when to stage each appearance. Rachel found a folder labeled Future Subjects and felt her stomach drop. Inside were detailed files on 3 other elderly residents of Harold's neighborhood, complete with medical information, daily routines, and vulnerability assessments. He was planning to do this again, she said. Harold was just the first. They put out a BOLO for Dr. Webb, but he had vanished completely. His apartment was empty, his car was gone, and his medical license turned out to be fake. The man they had been looking for didn't exist, at least not under that name. The investigation expanded to include the FBI, who discovered that similar cases had occurred in other cities over the past 5 years. An elderly person would die under mysterious circumstances, only to be seen by neighbors for days or weeks afterward. In each case, the investigating officers had found evidence of a visiting doctor who had subsequently disappeared. Rachel spent weeks poring over the evidence, trying to understand the mind behind such elaborate cruelty. The psychological profile that emerged was terrifying. A highly intelligent individual with medical training who was fascinated by the boundary between life and death. "He's not just a killer," she told the FBI profiler assigned to the case. "He's an artist. He turns death into performance art." The case went cold after 6 months, but Rachel never stopped thinking about it. She had nightmares about Harold's perfectly arranged corpse, about the methodical way Dr. Webb had manipulated his body to create the illusion of life. But the real horror wasn't the murder itself. It was the realization that someone could be so divorced from human empathy that they could turn death into an experiment, a game, a twisted form of entertainment. Rachel had seen evil before, but she had never encountered anything so coldly calculated, so completely devoid of human compassion. Dr. Webb hadn't killed Harold in a moment of passion or for financial gain. He had murdered him as part of the elaborate psychological experiment, turning his death into a performance that would haunt everyone who had unwittingly participated. The worst part was knowing that he was still out there, probably selecting his next subject, preparing for his next experiment. Somewhere, another elderly person was being watched, studied, chosen for the role of unwilling participant in a demented exploration of mortality. Rachel increased her patrols in neighborhoods with large elderly populations, watching for signs of the pattern she had learned to recognize. She gave talks to senior centers about staying safe, about being suspicious of medical professionals who seemed too eager to help. But she knew that no amount of vigilance could completely protect against someone as skilled and patient as Dr. Webb. He was a predator who understood that the elderly were often isolated, vulnerable, and trusting of medical authority. He used that trust against them in the most horrific way possible. The case had changed Rachel's view of police work. She had always known that there were bad people in the world, but she had never encountered someone who was bad in such a systematic, clinical way. Dr. Webb wasn't driven by passion or greed or anger. He was driven by a twisted intellectual curiosity that treated human life as nothing more than raw material for experimentation. 3 years later, Rachel was promoted to the detective division, but she never forgot the case that had defined her understanding of human evil. She kept Harold's file on her desk as a reminder that some crimes went beyond mere violence. They represented a complete abandonment of humanity. And somewhere out there, she knew Dr. Webb was still conducting his experiments, still turning death into art, still proving that the most terrifying monsters were often the ones who appeared most normal, most helpful, most trustworthy. The perfect crime scene at 4432 Desert View Lane had been perfect in more ways than one. It had been the perfect introduction to the kind of evil that wore a white coat and spoke in soothing tones while conducting the most inhuman experiments imaginable. Rachel never stopped looking for him, never stopped hoping that someday she would get the call that would give her the chance to bring Harold Winter's killer to justice. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, she could still see Harold's perfectly arranged corpse, still hear the echo of Dr. Webb's calm voice, still feel the chill of knowing that death, in the wrong hands, could become the ultimate performance art. The case remained open, a constant reminder that some crimes were too perfect to be solved quickly, too calculated to be stopped easily, and too evil to be forgotten. Officer Rachel Thompson had learned that the most dangerous criminals weren't the ones who lost control. They were the ones who never lost control at all. Officer James Morrison had been working interrogations for the Denver Police Department for 12 years, and he prided himself on his ability to read people. He could spot a lie from across the room, detect guilt in the slightest change of posture, and coax confessions from suspects who had sworn they would never talk. But the man sitting across from him in interview room 3 was different. Thomas Brennan was either completely innocent or the most skilled manipulator Morrison had ever encountered. The case had started 3 weeks ago with the disappearance of 8-year-old Emma Walsh from a playground in suburban Denver. Emma had been playing with friends when she vanished, sometime between 3:30 and 4 p.m. on a busy Saturday afternoon. Despite dozens of witnesses, no one had seen her leave the playground or noticed anything suspicious. The investigation had consumed the entire department. Every registered sex offender in a 50-mile radius had been questioned. Traffic cameras had been reviewed. Search teams had combed through miles of wilderness. But Emma had simply vanished, leaving behind only a pink bicycle and a backpack filled with carefully arranged toys. Then, yesterday morning, Thomas Brennan had walked into the police station and asked to speak with someone about Emma Walsh. Morrison studied the man across the table. Brennan was 42 years old, unemployed, living alone, in a small apartment about 6 blocks from the playground where Emma had disappeared. He had no criminal record, no history of mental illness, no obvious connection to the Walsh family. But he had information about Emma that hadn't been released to the public. "Tell me again about the backpack," Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. Brennan's hands were folded on the table, his posture relaxed but alert. Like I said, the toys were arranged in a specific pattern. The doll was on top, face down. The toy car was underneath, wheels up. The coloring books were stacked according to color: red, blue, green, yellow. Morrison felt a chill. Those details had been carefully kept from the media, known only to the investigating officers and the forensics team. Either Brennan was involved in Emma's disappearance, or he had access to information that should have been confidential. "How do you know about the arrangement of the toys, Mr. Brennan?" "I saw it happen," Brennan replied simply. "I was at the playground that day. I saw someone arrange the toys in the backpack after Emma was gone." "Can you describe this person?" "Tall, maybe 6 feet. Dark hair, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He was very careful about how he placed each item. It was like he was following a script." Morrison made notes, but his instincts were telling him something was wrong. The description was generic, almost too vague to be useful. "Did you see this person take Emma?" "Number I saw him afterward, organizing her things. Emma was already gone by then." "Why didn't you report this immediately?" For the first time, Brennan's composure slipped slightly. "I was scared. The person saw me watching. He looked right at me and I knew he was dangerous. But you're reporting it now." "Because I can't sleep." Every night I see Emma's face and I know I should have done something. I should have called the police right away." Morrison had heard hundreds of confessions over the years, and they all followed certain patterns. Genuine witnesses showed specific types of emotional responses: guilt, fear, urgency. Brennan displayed all the right emotions, but something about them felt rehearsed, too perfect. "Mr. Brennan, I need to ask you some direct questions. Did you have any role in Emma Walsh's disappearance?" "No." "Have you ever seen Emma before that day at the playground?" "No." "Do you know where Emma is now?" "No." Each answer came without hesitation, without the micro-expressions that usually accompanied deception. Morrison had interviewed thousands of suspects, and he had never encountered someone who could lie so smoothly, so convincingly. "I'd like to show you some photographs," Morrison said, pulling out a folder. "These are pictures of other children who have gone missing in the area over the past 2 years. Do you recognize any of them?" Brennan studied each photograph carefully, his expression neutral. "I don't recognize any of them." But Morrison caught something. A slight tightening around Brennan's eyes when he looked at the photo of 7-year-old Marcus Thompson, who had disappeared 6 months ago. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Take another look at this one," Morrison said, sliding Marcus's photo across the table. "Are you sure you've never seen this child?" Brennan looked at the photo again, his expression unchanged. "I'm sure. I've never seen him before." Morrison knew he was lying, but he couldn't prove it. The interview continued for another hour, with Brennan maintaining his story about witnessing the mysterious figure at the playground. His details were consistent, his emotions appeared genuine, and his body language suggested someone who was telling the truth. But Morrison's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. After the interview, Morrison walked Brennan to the front desk, where Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez was waiting. "Mr. Brennan," Rodriguez said, "we appreciate you coming forward. We'll investigate your report thoroughly." "Thank you," Brennan replied. "I just want to help find Emma." As Brennan left the station, Morrison turned to Rodriguez. "What do you think?" "I think he's either the most helpful witness we've ever had, or he's playing games with us." Morrison nodded. "I want surveillance on him. 24 hours a day, and I want to know everything about his background, where he's worked, who he's dated, what he does with his time. You think he's our guy? I think he knows more than he's telling us. And I think he's enjoying the attention." The surveillance began immediately. Officer Sarah Chen was assigned to watch Brennan's apartment, while Officer David Park monitored his movements during the day. What they discovered was both routine and unsettling. Brennan followed the same schedule every day. He woke up at 6:30 a.m., made coffee, and read the newspaper. He spent the morning cleaning his apartment with obsessive attention to detail. In the afternoon, he would go for long walks through residential neighborhoods, always carrying a small notebook in which he would occasionally make notes. "He's watching the kids," Chen reported after 3 days of surveillance. "He goes to different playgrounds, different schools. He never approaches anyone, never talks to anyone. He just watches and makes notes." Morrison felt his stomach turn. "What kind of notes?" "We can't get close enough to see, but he's very systematic about it. He'll spend 20 or 30 minutes at each location, writing detailed observations." The pattern was becoming clear. Brennan was conducting surveillance of his own, studying children's routines, learning their habits, but he was careful never to do anything that would be obviously illegal or suspicious. Morrison decided to bring Brennan in for a second interview. This time, he would be more direct. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for coming in again. I have a few follow-up questions about your statement." Brennan appeared relaxed, even pleased to be back in the interview room. Of course, I want to help in any way I can. We've been investigating your report about the man at the playground. So far, we haven't been able to find any evidence that supports your story. I understand. I wish I could be more helpful. The thing is, Mr. Brennan, we have security footage from the playground that day. We've reviewed every frame, and there's no sign of anyone matching the description you gave us. For the first time, Brennan showed genuine emotion, a flash of anger quickly suppressed. Maybe the camera didn't capture that area of the playground. The cameras cover the entire playground, every angle, every moment from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Then maybe I was mistaken about the time. Morrison leaned forward. Or maybe you were mistaken about seeing someone else at all. I know what I saw. Do you? Because the more I think about it, the more it seems like you're describing yourself, Mr. Brennan. You're about 6 feet tall, you have dark hair, and you own a gray hoodie. Brennan's composure cracked slightly. That's a coincidence. Is it? Let me ask you again. Did you have any role in Emma Walsh's disappearance? No, but this time Morrison caught it. A micro-expression of satisfaction, a barely perceptible smile. Brennan was enjoying the game. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to be direct with you. I think you took Emma Walsh. I think you've been studying children in the neighborhood for months, learning their routines, picking your target. And I think you came here not to help us, but to insert yourself into the investigation. That's not true. Then explain to me why you've been visiting playgrounds and schools every day for the past 3 weeks. Explain why you carry a notebook and make detailed observations about children's activities. Brennan's mask slipped completely now. The helpful witness disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. I'm a people watcher. It's not illegal to observe public spaces. It's not illegal, but it's suspicious, especially when combined with your detailed knowledge of evidence that wasn't released to the public. I've already explained that. No, you've lied about it. There was no mysterious figure at the playground. You arranged Emma's toys in her backpack. You know details about the crime scene because you were there when it happened. Brennan leaned back in his chair, his expression now openly hostile. Prove it. Morrison felt a chill at the challenge in Brennan's voice. We will. No, you won't. Because you have nothing but suspicion and guesswork. You can't prove I was at the playground. You can't prove I had any contact with Emma Walsh. You can't even prove that she's dead. The last comment hit Morrison like a physical blow. What did you say? I said you can't prove she's dead. For all you know, she's alive somewhere, playing happily with her new family. Morrison's blood ran cold. What do you know about Emma's current situation? Nothing more than what I've told you. But the damage was done. Brennan had revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had. The implication that Emma was still alive, that she had been taken by someone who viewed kidnapping as a form of adoption. Mr. Brennan, I need you to tell me where Emma is. I don't know where she is. But you know she's alive. I don't know anything. Morrison called for a break and stepped outside the interview room. His hands were shaking as he called his supervisor. Captain Walsh, I need a search warrant for Thomas Brennan's apartment. I think he's our guy. What evidence do you have? He knows details about the crime scene that weren't released to the public. He's been conducting surveillance of children in the neighborhood, and he just implied that Emma Walsh is still alive. That's not enough for a warrant. Captain, I know this guy's involved. I can feel it. Feelings don't hold up in court, Morrison. Get me something concrete. Morrison returned to the interview room, where Brennan was sitting calmly, apparently unconcerned by the accusations against him. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is Emma Walsh? I don't know. You know she's alive. You said so yourself. I said you couldn't prove she was dead. That's not the same thing. Morrison realized he was dealing with someone who understood the legal system, who knew exactly how far he could push without crossing the line into provable guilt. Let me tell you what I think happened, Morrison said. I think you've been watching Emma for weeks, learning her routine, waiting for the right moment. I think you took her from the playground, and you're keeping her somewhere. And I think you came here to taunt us, to prove how clever you are. That's an interesting theory. It's more than a theory, it's the truth. Brennan smiled, and Morrison felt a chill at the expression. The truth is that you're a desperate cop who's failing to solve a case. You've got nothing on me, so you're trying to turn me into a suspect. I don't have to turn you into anything. You are a suspect. Based on what? The fact that I tried to help you? The fact that I witnessed something at the playground? Morrison realized he was trapped. Brennan was too smart, too careful. He had inserted himself into the investigation in a way that made him appear helpful while actually making him untouchable. You're free to go, Morrison said finally. But this conversation isn't over. Yes, it is, Brennan replied, standing up. Unless you have evidence of a crime, I won't be back. As Brennan left the station, Morrison felt a rage unlike anything he'd experienced in his career. He knew, absolutely knew, that Brennan was guilty. But knowing and proving were two different things. The investigation continued for another week, with surveillance teams following Brennan around the clock. But he was careful now, avoiding playgrounds and schools, sticking to routine activities that couldn't be interpreted as suspicious. Then, on a Thursday morning, Morrison got the call he'd been dreading. Officer Morrison, this is Dr. Janet Stevens from Denver General Hospital. We have a young girl here who says her name is Emma Walsh. Morrison's heart stopped. Is she okay? She's physically unharmed, but she's been traumatized. She says she's been staying with a man who told her he was her new daddy. Where did you find her? She walked into the emergency room about an hour ago. She says the man brought her to a park and told her to wait for him, but he never came back. Morrison was already grabbing his keys. I'm on my way. Emma Walsh was sitting in a hospital bed, clutching a stuffed animal that Morrison didn't recognize. She looked thin and scared, but she was alive. Emma, I'm Officer Morrison. I've been looking for you. Are you going to take me home to my mommy? Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to take you home. But first, I need to ask you some questions about the man who was taking care of you. Emma nodded, gripping the stuffed animal tighter. He said his name was Tommy. He was nice at first, but then he got angry when I cried for my mommy. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. Can you tell me what Tommy looked like? He was tall and had dark hair. He wore a gray sweater a lot. He said I was his special girl now. The description matched Brennan perfectly, but Morrison knew it wouldn't be enough to arrest him. Emma, did Tommy tell you where you were staying? In a basement. It was dark and cold. He had lots of pictures on the walls. Pictures of what? Other kids. He said they were all his special children, but they had to go away. Morrison's blood ran cold. Did he tell you what happened to the other children? Emma's eyes filled with tears. He said they went to sleep forever when they stopped being good. Dr. Stevens pulled Morrison aside. Detective, this child has been severely traumatized. She's been isolated, manipulated, and threatened. The psychological damage is extensive. Did you do a physical examination? Yes. She shows signs of prolonged confinement, but no evidence of sexual assault. However, she's malnourished and has several minor injuries consistent with being kept in a confined space. Morrison returned to Emma's bedside. "Emma, this is very important. Did Tommy ever bring you to a police station? Did he ever talk to police officers?" "Yes." "He took me once, but I had to wait in the car. He said if I made any noise, something bad would happen to my mommy." Morrison's hands were shaking as he made notes. Brennan had brought Emma with him to the police station, probably parked just outside while he gave his false statement. The arrogance was staggering. "Emma, you're safe now. Tommy can't hurt you anymore." "But what if he comes back? He said he would always find me." "He won't find you. We're going to make sure of that." Morrison called for an immediate arrest warrant for Thomas Brennan. With Emma's testimony and the physical evidence of her confinement, they finally had enough to charge him. But when the arrest team arrived at Brennan's apartment, he was gone. The apartment was empty, but not abandoned. It had been carefully cleaned, with no trace of Emma's presence. However, in the basement, the team found something that made Morrison's blood run cold. The walls were covered with photographs of children, hundreds of them, all taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Each photo was labeled with a name, age, and detailed observations about the child's routine. Emma's photo was among them, but so were dozens of others. "Jesus Christ," Officer Chen whispered, looking at the wall. "How long has he been doing this?" Morrison studied the photographs. Some were old, yellowed with age. Others were recent, probably taken within the past few months. In the corner, he found a filing cabinet filled with folders, each one dedicated to a different child. "He's been planning this for years," Morrison said. "Emma wasn't his first victim. She was just the first one he got caught taking." In one of the folders, Morrison found newspaper clippings about missing children from across the country. The pattern was clear. Brennan had been moving from city to city, stalking children, taking them, and then disappearing when the investigation got too close. "Look at this," Chen said, holding up a journal. "It's like a hunting diary." Morrison read the entries with growing horror. Brennan had detailed his methods, his selection criteria, his techniques for gaining children's trust. The entries were clinical, detached, describing the children as objects to be collected rather than human beings. But the most disturbing discovery was in the back of the journal, a list of names with dates next to them. Some of the names had been crossed out with red ink. Others had question marks. And at the bottom of the list, in fresh ink, was Emma Walsh's name with yesterday's date. He was planning to kill her, Morrison said. That's why he let her go. He was moving to the next phase of his plan. The manhunt for Brennan intensified, with law enforcement agencies across the country joining the search. But Morrison knew they were looking for a ghost, someone who had perfected the art of disappearing, of reinventing himself, of blending into new communities. 3 days later, Morrison got a call that confirmed his worst fears. "Detective Morrison, this is Detective Sarah Palmer from the Seattle Police Department. We have a situation here that might be connected to your case." "What kind of situation?" "A man matching the description of Thomas Brennan was seen at a playground this morning. He was talking to a group of children, claiming to be a photographer for a local magazine. When a parent got suspicious and called us, he disappeared." Morrison felt sick. "Did he take anyone?" "Not that we know of, but we found this in his abandoned rental car." Morrison waited, dreading what he was about to hear. It's a notebook with detailed observations about 12 different children in the Seattle area. Names, addresses, school schedules, parent work schedules. "Detective, this guy is already hunting again." Morrison closed his eyes. "He's not going to stop. That's what we're afraid of." The case had become a federal investigation, with FBI profilers working around the clock to understand Brennan's methods and predict his next move. Morrison was assigned to the task force, his expertise in reading Brennan's behavior considered crucial to the investigation. But as the weeks passed without any sign of Brennan, Morrison began to understand the true horror of what they were dealing with. Brennan wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a predator who had turned child abduction into a refined art form. The psychological profile that emerged was terrifying. Brennan was highly intelligent, methodical, and completely lacking in empathy. He viewed children as objects to be collected, studied, and eventually discarded when they no longer served his purposes. He's not driven by sexual desire, FBI profiler Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained to the task force. He's driven by a need for control, for power over the helpless. The children are trophies, proof of his superiority. How do we catch someone like that? Morrison asked. We don't, Martinez replied grimly. We wait for him to make a mistake, and we hope it happens before he takes another child. Morrison returned to Denver with a heavy heart. Emma Walsh was reunited with her family, but the trauma of her experience would stay with her forever. The knowledge that her kidnapper was still out there, still hunting, made her recovery even more difficult. The case consumed Morrison's thoughts day and night. He studied every detail of Brennan's methods, looking for patterns, weaknesses, anything that might help them predict his next move. But Brennan was too smart, too careful, too experienced. 6 months later, Morrison got the call he'd been dreading. Detective Morrison, this is Detective James Cooper from the Portland Police Department. We have a situation. Morrison's stomach dropped. Another child? 7-year-old Michael Santos. Disappeared from a birthday party yesterday afternoon. But here's the thing. Someone called in a tip this morning. A man claiming to be a witness to the abduction. Morrison felt a chill. Let me guess. He had detailed information about the crime scene that wasn't released to the public. Exactly. And Detective Morrison, the caller asked specifically to speak with you. Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. What was the message? He said to tell you that he enjoyed your conversation in Denver. He said the game is just beginning. Morrison realized with horror that Brennan had been watching him, studying him, making him part of the twisted game. The interview in Denver hadn't been about inserting himself into the investigation. It had been about choosing his next opponent. Detective Cooper, I need you to trace that call immediately. And I need you to put every available officer on this case. We're not just hunting a kidnapper. We're hunting someone who's turned child abduction into a game. What kind of game? Morrison looked out the window at the Denver skyline, thinking about Emma Walsh, about the wall of photographs in Brennan's apartment, about the children whose names had been crossed out in red ink. The kind where the rules keep changing, he said, and the only way to win is to refuse to play. But Morrison knew that wasn't an option. As long as Brennan was out there, as long as children were disappearing, he would have to keep playing the game. The question was whether he could learn the rules fast enough to save the next victim. The phone rang again, and Morrison answered with trembling hands. Detective Morrison, this is Thomas Brennan. I think it's time we had another conversation. Morrison's heart pounded as he signaled for the call to be traced. Where are you, Thomas? I'm everywhere, Detective. I'm in every playground, every school, every place where children gather. I'm the man parents don't notice. The helpful stranger who offers assistance, the concerned citizen who reports suspicious activity. What do you want? I want you to understand that this isn't just about the children, Detective. It's about the game. The elaborate dance between predator and protector. You played your part beautifully in Denver. Let Michael go. He's just a child." "They're all just children, Detective. That's what makes them so perfect, so trusting, so willing to believe that adults have their best interests at heart." Morrison was frantically signaling to the officers around him, but he knew the call was being routed through multiple relays, making it impossible to trace. "Thomas, you don't have to do this. We can get you help." "Help?" Brennan laughed, and the sound made Morrison's skin crawl. "I don't need help, Detective. I need worthy opponents. The game is no fun if it's too easy." "This isn't a game. These are children's lives." "Everything is a game, Detective. The question is whether you're playing to win or playing not to lose." The line went dead. Morrison stared at the phone, his hands shaking. He had been drawn into something far worse than a simple kidnapping case. He was now part of Brennan's twisted game, a participant in a sick competition where children's lives were the stakes. Over the next few days, Morrison worked with the Portland police to coordinate the search for Michael Santos. But he knew they were fighting a losing battle. Brennan was too smart, too experienced, too willing to use children as pawns in his psychological warfare. Then, on the fourth day, Michael Santos walked into a Portland police station, unharmed but traumatized, carrying a note addressed to Morrison. "Detective Morrison," the note read, "I hope you enjoyed our first real game. The child is returned to you undamaged as a sign of my respect for your skills. This is only the beginning. The rules are simple. I will take a child and you will try to find them. If you succeed, the child goes free. If you fail, well, let's just say that failure has consequences. The game begins again in 1 month. I suggest you use the time to prepare. Your move, Detective." Morrison crumpled the note, his hands shaking with rage and fear. He had become part of something monstrous. A game where children were used as pieces on a board designed by a madman. But he also realized that he had been given something unprecedented, an opportunity to predict Brennan's actions, to be ready for his next move. The question was whether he could use that advantage to finally bring the predator to justice. Morrison spent the next month preparing. He studied every case file, every psychological profile, every piece of evidence related to Brennan's methods. He coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the country, setting up networks of communication and response teams. Most importantly, he tried to think like Brennan, to understand the twisted logic that drove his actions. The predator had made Morrison part of his game, but that also meant Morrison could influence the rules. 28 days after Michael Santos was returned, Morrison's phone rang. "Detective Morrison, are you ready for round 2? Morrison took a deep breath. "I'm ready, Thomas, but this time, I'm changing the rules." "Oh? And how do you propose to do that?" "By not playing your game. By treating this as what it really is, a manhunt for a child killer. But Detective, you have to play. If you don't, innocent children will suffer." Morrison felt a chill, but he had made his decision. "No, Thomas. If I play your game, innocent children will suffer. The only way to win is to refuse to participate." There was a long pause. "You're making a mistake, Detective, and we'll see." The line went dead. Morrison knew he had declared war on one of the most dangerous predators he had ever encountered. But he also knew that playing Brennan's game would only enable his crimes, would give him the psychological satisfaction he craved. The hunt for Thomas Brennan continued, but now it was on Morrison's terms. No more games, no more psychological manipulation, no more children used as pawns in a twisted competition. It was a manhunt, pure and simple. And Morrison would not stop until the predator was caught. The case had changed him, had shown him depths of human evil he had never imagined. but it had also shown him the importance of refusing to be drawn into the darkness, of maintaining the moral clarity that separated protectors from predators. Detective James Morrison had learned that some criminals were too dangerous to be reasoned with, too skilled to be outmaneuvered, too evil to be understood. The only response was relentless pursuit, unwavering determination, and the absolute refusal to play by the rules of those who preyed on the innocent. The confession room had become a battlefield, and Morrison was determined to win the war. Thomas Brennan was still out there, still hunting, still playing his twisted games. But now he was facing an opponent who understood that the only way to defeat a predator was to refuse to become prey. The game was over. The hunt had begun, and Detective Morrison would not rest until justice was served, and the children of America were safe from the monster who had turned their innocence into a weapon of psychological warfare. The confession room had taught him that some confessions were lies, some witnesses were predators, and some games were too dangerous to play. But it had also taught him that the badge he wore represented something unbreakable, the commitment to protect the innocent, no matter what the cost. Thomas Brennan had made his choice. Now Morrison had made his. The hunt continued, and it would not end until the predator was caught and the children were safe. That was not just Morrison's job. It was his sacred duty, his unbreakable oath, his reason for wearing the badge. The confession room had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. But it had also become a symbol of everything that was right about the people who chose to stand against the darkness. Detective James Morrison was one of those people, and he would not stop fighting until the darkness was defeated and the light prevailed. The case remained open, the hunt continued, and the children of America slept a little less safely knowing that monsters like Thomas Brennan were still out there. But they also slept knowing that people like Detective Morrison were standing guard, watching over them, ready to sacrifice everything to keep them safe. The confession room had taught him that some confessions were worth more than others, and Morrison's confession was simple. He would never stop hunting, never stop fighting, never stop believing that justice would ultimately prevail. Thomas Brennan had started a game. Detective Morrison had ended it. Now the real work could begin. The blood was still warm when Officer Marcus Rivera arrived at the scene, but that wasn't what made his skin crawl. It was the phone, still ringing in the dead woman's hand, her fingers wrapped around it like a lifeline that had failed her. Each ring echoed through the cramped apartment at 1247 Elm Street, a sound that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, though he didn't know it yet. Sacramento PD had seen its share of domestic violence calls, but this was different. The victim, Rebecca Chen, lay sprawled across her kitchen floor, multiple stab wounds creating a grotesque pattern across her torso. The apartment was untouched. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing missing. Just Rebecca, the ringing phone, and a message scrawled in her own blood across the refrigerator. She called for help. Marcus carefully extracted the phone from Rebecca's grip, noting the rigidity already setting in. The caller ID showed the same number over and over, 911. 43 missed calls in the past hour, all to emergency services. But that was impossible. Marcus had been working dispatch earlier that evening, and there hadn't been any calls from this address. "Rivera, you need to see this," called his partner, Officer Sarah Walsh, from the bedroom. Her voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. Sarah was a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything the city had to offer. The bedroom was pristine except for the laptop on the nightstand, its screen glowing with an active video call. The timestamp showed the call had been running for 3 hours and 14 minutes. On the screen was a man Marcus didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing a cheap suit, sitting in what appeared to be an office cubicle. The man's eyes were fixed on the camera, and his mouth was moving, but no sound came through the speakers. "Have you tried ending the call?" Marcus asked. Sarah shook her head. "Can't. The controls are frozen. And look at this." She pointed to the corner of the screen where the caller's information should be. Instead of a name or number, there was only a string of zeros. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. The man's lips were moving in a repetitive pattern, as if he were saying the same words over and over. "Can you read lips?" "A little," Sarah admitted. "But I don't think you want to know what he's saying." The phone in Marcus's hand rang again. The caller ID still showed 911, but Marcus knew that was impossible. He answered anyway. "Hello?" The voice was familiar. It was Rebecca Chen, but clearer than any dead person should sound. Marcus dropped the phone as if it had burned him. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the call ending abruptly. Sarah was staring at him, her face pale. "What did you hear?" she demanded. Rebecca, she sounded like she was calling for help. They both looked back at the laptop screen. The man in the video call had stopped moving his lips and was now staring directly at the camera. His eyes seemed to follow Marcus as he moved around the room. Then, slowly, the man began to smile. The apartment's landline started ringing. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. The landline was an old rotary phone on the kitchen counter, its cord wrapped neatly around the base. Neither of them had noticed it before. "Don't answer it," Sarah whispered. But Marcus was already moving toward the kitchen. Each ring seemed to pull him forward, against his better judgment. The sound was different from a normal phone. Deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. He picked up the receiver. "Sacramento Police Department," he said, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. "Officer Rivera." The voice was definitely Rebecca Chen's, but there was something wrong with it. The cadence was off, like someone reading from a script. "I need to report a murder." "Ma'am, this is my own murder, Officer Rivera." "I'm calling to report my own murder." The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down carefully, his hands shaking. When he looked up, Sarah was backing toward the apartment door, her service weapon drawn. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." But Marcus couldn't move. The laptop screen had changed. Instead of the man in the cubicle, it now showed a view of the apartment. Their apartment from above. He could see himself standing in the kitchen, Sarah by the door, and Rebecca's body on the floor. But there was something else in the frame, something that shouldn't be there. Standing behind Marcus, just out of his peripheral vision, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by shadows. But Marcus could see its hand resting on his shoulder, a hand that he couldn't feel. "Sarah," he whispered, not daring to turn around. "Can you see?" "I see it," she said, her voice tight. "Don't move." The figure on the screen leaned down, its face coming close to Marcus's ear. On the laptop, he could see its lips moving, but he couldn't hear anything. Then, slowly, the figure raised its other hand and pointed at the camera. The screen went black. In the silence that followed, Marcus became aware of a new sound. Breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from behind him. He could feel the presence now, cold and malevolent, standing so close that he should have been able to touch it. "Don't turn around," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Just walk toward me, slowly." Marcus took a step forward. The breathing grew louder, more labored. Another step. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Another step, and the old rotary phone began to ring again. This time, neither of them moved to answer it. The ringing stopped abruptly. replaced by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself. It was Rebecca Chen, but not the Rebecca who had called for help. This voice was different, older, as if it had been speaking for centuries. "You can't leave," the voice said, "not until you understand." "Understand what?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why I kept calling, why I had to keep calling." The apartment around them began to change. The walls grew darker, the ceiling lower. The furniture started to fade, as if it were being erased from existence. Soon, only the essential elements remained: Rebecca's body, the phones, and the laptop. "She wasn't the first," the voice continued. "She won't be the last. They all call for help, but help never comes, not in time. Never in time." Marcus felt something brush against his hand, cold, clammy fingers trying to intertwine with his. He jerked his hand away, but the touch lingered, like a memory that wouldn't fade. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, sweeping her weapon in a wide arc. "What do you want?" The voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I'm everyone who called for help. Everyone who died waiting for someone to answer. I'm the voice on the other end of the line, the one you never hear until it's too late." The laptop screen flickered back to life, showing the man in the cubicle again. But now, Marcus could see that it wasn't a man at all. It was a compilation of faces. Hundreds of them, all superimposed on each other, all with the same desperate expression. All with the same moving lips, all saying the same words: "Help me." "This is what you do," the voice said. "You take the calls, you write the reports, you arrive at the scene after it's over. You're always too late, always." Marcus felt a surge of anger. "We do our best, we save people. Do you?" The voice was closer now, as if it were speaking directly into his ear. "Or do you just clean up the mess after it's too late?" Images flashed through Marcus's mind. Every call he'd responded to, every victim he'd found, every person he'd failed to save. The memories came in a rush, each one more vivid than the last, until he could barely distinguish between past and present. There was Jennifer Martinez, 19 years old, who had called 911 6 times before her ex-boyfriend finally kicked down her door. Marcus had arrived to find her body in the bathtub, her phone still clutched in her hand. The dispatcher had logged the calls as domestic dispute and given them a low priority. There was elderly William Thompson, who had been calling for help for 3 days after falling in his basement. His neighbors had heard him screaming, but the responding officers had knocked on the front door, received no answer, and left. When they finally found him, he had died of dehydration, his fingernails worn down to the quick from clawing at the concrete walls. There was little Amy Carter, 8 years old, who had called from her bedroom closet while her stepfather murdered her mother downstairs. The call had been routed to the wrong district, then lost in the system for 47 minutes. By the time Marcus arrived, Amy was dead too, her small hand still reaching for the phone. "Stop!" Marcus gasped, clutching his head. "This is what it feels like," the voice said. "To call for help and know that no one will come. To die alone, forgotten, while the people who are supposed to protect you are somewhere else, doing something else." The rotary phone rang again, but this time Marcus could see the caller. It was him, his own face twisted with desperation, his own voice pleading for help. The call was coming from some time in the future, when he would be the one who needed saving. "You see now," the voice said. "You understand." Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We have to go, now." But as they reached the threshold, the apartment door slammed shut. The deadbolt turned with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. "You can't leave," the voice said. "Not until you've answered all the calls. The phones began to ring. All of them at once. The rotary phone in the kitchen, the cell phone on the floor, the landline in the bedroom that Marcus hadn't noticed before, and dozens of others that materialized from the shadows. Each ring was a cry for help, a plea for salvation that would never come. Marcus and Sarah stood back to back in the center of the apartment, surrounded by the cacophony of ringing phones. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere were pressing down on them. "Answer them," the voice commanded. "Answer them all." Marcus reached for the nearest phone, but his hand passed through it like smoke. The phones were there, but they weren't. They existed in the space between life and death, between hope and despair. "I can't," he said. "Then you'll stay here," the voice replied. "Forever, just like she did." Rebecca's body began to move, her dead eyes opening, fixing on Marcus with an expression of infinite sadness. Her mouth opened, and the voice that came out was her own. Not the ancient voice that had been speaking, but Rebecca Chen, the woman who had died alone in her apartment. "I called 43 times, she said, sitting up slowly. 43 times and no one answered. Do you know what that feels like? To know that help is just a phone call away, but no one cares enough to pick up." Marcus tried to speak, but no words came. The guilt was crushing, a weight that threatened to drive him to his knees. "We tried," Sarah said. "We're here now." Rebecca's head turned towards Sarah, and she smiled. A sad, knowing smile. "You're here now, but I'm already dead. That's the problem, isn't it? You're always too late." The ringing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the cacophony. In that silence, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, the sound of his own breathing, the whisper of his own mortality. "There's a way out," Rebecca said, standing slowly. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an inexpert hand. "But it requires a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Marcus asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Someone has to stay," Rebecca said. "Someone has to answer the calls. Someone has to bear witness to all the people who died waiting for help." Marcus looked at Sarah, and he could see the understanding in her eyes. One of them would have to stay, to become part of whatever this place was, to join the voices that called for help in the darkness. "It should be me," Marcus said. "I was the one who answered the phone." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm the senior officer. It's my responsibility." Rebecca laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "You still don't understand. It's not about who stays, it's about who answers." The phones began to ring again, but this time Marcus could hear the individual voices, each one a person who had died waiting for help, each one a life that had been lost while the people who were supposed to protect them were somewhere else. He could hear children, elderly people, mothers, fathers, all crying out in their final moments. "Answer them," Rebecca said. "Answer them all, and you can go." Marcus reached for the rotary phone, and this time his hand didn't pass through it. The receiver was cold, almost burning against his skin. He lifted it to his ear. "Hello?" he said. "Help me," the voice on the other end said. It was a young woman, terrified, speaking in a whisper. "Please, he's in the house. He's coming up the stairs." Marcus looked at Sarah, then at Rebecca. "What do I say?" "Tell her the truth," Rebecca said. "Tell her that help is coming, but it won't be in time. I can't do that. Then you'll never leave." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every life he'd failed to save. Every call he'd responded to too late. The woman on the phone was crying now, her sobs echoing through the receiver. "Help is coming," he said, his voice breaking. But I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. The line went dead. The next phone was already ringing. Marcus answered it, and the next one, and the next. Each call was a story of desperation, of people who had died alone while waiting for someone to save them. Each call was a reminder of the imperfections in a system that was supposed to protect, but too often failed. There was Maria Santos, who had called for help when her husband started beating her with a baseball bat. The dispatcher had put her on hold for 6 minutes because there was a more urgent call. A cat stuck in a tree. By the time the officers arrived, Maria was in a coma that she would never wake up from. There was David Kim, who had called to report a break-in while hiding in his closet. The responding officer had driven by the house twice, but hadn't seen anything suspicious from the street. David was found 3 days later, tortured and murdered in his own bedroom. There was elderly Rose Patterson, who had called for help when she smelled gas in her apartment. The dispatcher had told her to open a window and wait for the fire department. The building exploded 17 minutes later, killing Rose and 4 of her neighbors. With each call, Marcus felt a piece of himself slipping away. The guilt was consuming him, transforming him into something else, something that belonged to this place, this nexus of unanswered pleas and broken promises. "Marcus," Sarah said urgently, "you have to stop. You're losing yourself." But Marcus couldn't stop. The phones kept ringing, and the voices kept calling, and each one deserved an answer even if it was too late. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning in this place. Marcus answered call after call, each one taking him further from the world of the living and deeper into the realm of the dead. His voice began to change, becoming older, more distant, until he sounded like the ancient voice that had first spoken to them. There was Timothy Walsh, Sarah's own brother, who had called for help when his car went off the road during a snowstorm. The call had been routed to the wrong county, then lost in the system for 3 hours. Timothy had frozen to death in his car, less than a mile from the police station. Sarah gasped when she heard Timothy's voice, young and scared, calling out for help that would never come. She reached for the phone, but Marcus held it away from her. "I have to," he said, his voice hollow. "I have to answer." "Timothy," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Timothy couldn't hear her. He was trapped in that moment, forever calling for help, forever waiting for someone to save him. "That's enough," Sarah said, grabbing the phone from Marcus's hand. "We're leaving." But when she looked at Marcus, she saw that it was too late. His eyes were empty, distant, as if he were looking at something far away. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy appearance, and his breathing was shallow. "Marcus?" He looked at her, but she could see that he was no longer entirely present. Part of him had joined the voices, had become one with the eternal chorus of the unanswered. "I have to stay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Someone has to answer the calls." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're both leaving, now." She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. But as they reached it, the apartment began to dissolve around them. The walls faded, the floor became transparent, and soon they were standing in a void, surrounded by nothing but the sound of ringing phones. In the distance, Sarah could see lights, the lights of the city, the lights of the living world, but they were fading, becoming dimmer with each passing moment. "Run," Rebecca said, her voice now kind, almost maternal. "Run, and don't look back." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Marcus's hand and ran toward the lights, toward the world they had left behind. Behind them, the phones continued to ring, and the voices continued to call, but the sounds grew fainter with each step. They burst through the apartment door and into the hallway of the building, gasping for breath. The normal world crashed back around them. The smell of stale cigarettes and cooking food, the sound of televisions playing in other apartments, the feel of solid ground beneath their feet. Marcus collapsed against the wall, his face pale and drawn. Did that really happen? Sarah nodded, unable to speak. They had survived, but she knew that they would never be the same. The voices would always be with them, a reminder of every call they failed to answer, every person they failed to save. As they walked back to their patrol car, Sarah's radio crackled to life. Unit 47, we have a possible domestic disturbance at 1247 Elm Street. Caller reports sounds of a struggle. Sarah looked at Marcus, and she could see the same realization in her eyes. They had come full circle. The cycle was starting again. Unit 47, do you copy? Sarah picked up the radio, her hand shaking. We copy. Dispatch. We're already on scene. But as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. They would never really be on scene. They would always be too late, always arriving after the damage was done, always answering the calls that should have been answered sooner. The phone in apartment 1247 began to ring again, and somewhere in the city, another voice cried out for help, knowing that no one would hear, no one would come, no one would answer until it was too late. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. And Marcus Rivera, officer of the Sacramento Police Department, picked up his radio and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We're on our way. But he knew, as he had always known, that they would never be fast enough. The voices would always be waiting. In the weeks that followed, Marcus would find himself unable to sleep without hearing the phones ring. He would dream of Rebecca Chen, of Timothy Walsh, of all the voices that had called out in the darkness. He would wake up screaming, his sheets soaked with sweat, his hands reaching for phones that weren't there. Sarah tried to help him, but she was fighting her own demons. She had requested a transfer to the day shift, but the voices followed her there too. Every call she answered, every person she helped, was overshadowed by the memory of those she couldn't save. The apartment at 1247 Elm Street was officially closed as a crime scene, but the neighbors reported strange sounds coming from inside. Phones ringing at all hours, voices calling for help, the sound of someone crying. The building's owner tried to have the apartment cleaned and re-rented, but no one would stay more than a few days. Marcus returned to work, but his colleagues noticed the change in him. He answered every call with an urgency that bordered on desperation, as if he were trying to outrun something that was always just behind him. He volunteered for extra shifts, took on cases that other officers avoided, and pushed himself to the point of exhaustion. You can't save everyone, Sarah told him one night as they sat in their patrol car, watching the city sleep around them. I know, Marcus replied, but his voice was hollow. But I have to try. The radio crackled to life, and both officers tensed. It was another call, another person in need of help, another chance to arrive too late. Unit 47, we have a possible domestic disturbance at 1247 Elm Street. Caller reports sounds of a struggle. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other, their faces pale. It was the same call, the same address, the same desperate plea for help. Unit 47, do you copy? Marcus picked up the radio, his hand steady despite the fear in his eyes. We copy. Dispatch. We're on our way. As they drove through the empty streets toward Elm Street, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were trapped in a loop, doomed to repeat the same cycle of failure over and over again. The voices would always be calling, always be waiting, always be dying while they rushed to save them. The apartment building came into view, dark and silent except for the faint glow of a single light in the window of apartment 1247. Marcus parked the car and turned off the engine, but neither officer moved to get out. "We don't have to go in," Sarah said quietly. "We could call for backup, wait for someone else to handle it." "No," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We have to answer. That's what we do." They stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. The front door was unlocked, just as it had been before. The hallway was dark, lit only by the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. As they climbed the stairs to the third floor, they could hear it, the sound of a phone ringing, over and over, the same desperate call for help that had started it all. Marcus reached for the door handle, then stopped. "What if we can't save her this time either?" "Then we try again," Sarah said, "and we keep trying until we get it right." They opened the door and stepped into the apartment, ready to face whatever waited for them inside. The phone was still ringing, the sound echoing through the empty rooms like a heartbeat. In the kitchen, Rebecca Chen lay on the floor, her blood pooling around her body. But this time, something was different. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at them with an expression of hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "help me." Marcus knelt beside her, pressing his hands against her wounds to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Rebecca. Help is coming." Sarah was already on the radio, calling for an ambulance, for backup, for anyone who could help. This time, they would be fast enough. This time, they would save her. But as Marcus looked into Rebecca's eyes, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Behind the hope, behind the fear, there was something else. A knowledge that this had all happened before, that it would happen again, that they were all trapped in a cycle that could never be broken. "I keep calling," Rebecca whispered, her breath growing weaker. "I keep calling, but no one ever comes in time." "We're here now," Marcus said, his voice desperate. "We're here, and we're not going to let you die." But even as he said it, he could feel her life slipping away. The blood was flowing faster than he could stop it, and her eyes were beginning to glaze over. "Tell me," she said, her voice fading. "Tell me why you're always too late." Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. How could he explain that the system was broken, that there weren't enough officers, that the calls came faster than they could respond? How could he explain that they were human, that they made mistakes, that they couldn't be everywhere at once? "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm so sorry." Rebecca smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I know," she said, "but that doesn't change anything, does it?" Her eyes closed, and she was gone. Marcus sat back on his heels, his hands covered in blood, his heart heavy with failure. Around him, the apartment began to fade, the walls becoming transparent, the furniture dissolving into mist. "It's starting again," Sarah said, her voice distant. "The cycle is starting again." Marcus looked up at her, and he could see the same realization in her eyes. They were trapped, doomed to repeat this moment over and over, forever arriving too late, forever failing to save the people who needed them most. The phone began to ring again, and Marcus knew that somewhere in the city, another voice was calling for help. Another person was dying while they rushed to save them. Another soul was about to join the endless chorus of the unanswered. He picked up the phone, knowing what he would hear, knowing that it would never be enough. "Hello," he said. "Help me," the voice on the other end said. It was Rebecca Chen, but it was also everyone else who had ever called for help and received only silence in return. "Please, help me." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of eternity pressing down on him. "We're on our way," he said, his voice breaking. "We're on our way." But he knew, as he had always known, that they would never be fast enough. The voices would always be waiting, and the cycle would continue forever and ever until the end of time. Officer Jessica Martinez had been walking the midnight beat in downtown Portland for 3 years, and she prided herself on knowing every doorway, every alley, every shadow where trouble might hide. The Pearl District was her territory, a mix of converted warehouses, trendy lofts, and the occasional abandoned building that served as a reminder of the area's grittier past. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive, and the familiar streets felt like a maze designed to trap her. It started with the graffiti. Jessica was making her usual rounds when she noticed it. Fresh spray paint on the side of Murphy's Deli, still wet enough to catch the light from the street lamp. The message was simple, written in dripping red letters. "They're watching you, Jessica." Her blood ran cold. Graffiti mentioning police officers by name wasn't uncommon, but this felt different. Personal, threatening. She radioed it in to dispatch, but the response was garbled, filled with static that made it impossible to understand. She tried again, but the radio was dead. Jessica pulled out her cell phone to call for backup, but the screen showed no signal. That was odd. She had full bars just 10 minutes ago. She shook the phone, tried turning it off and on again, but nothing worked. A sound behind her made her turn. The alley that ran behind the deli was empty, but she could have sworn she heard footsteps. Heavy boots on concrete, moving slowly, deliberately. She drew her flashlight and shone it into the darkness. "Portland Police," she called out. "If someone's back there, you need to come out now." Nothing. Just the distant hum of traffic and the soft whisper of wind through the urban canyon. Jessica continued her patrol, but the feeling of being watched intensified with each step. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone following her, but the street was empty. The storefronts were dark, the windows reflecting her image back at her like a series of mirrors. 3 blocks down, she found more graffiti. This time it was on the window of a closed bookstore. "We know where you live, Jessica. 2247 Hawthorne Street, apartment 3B. Jessica's heart hammered in her chest. That was her address. Her exact address, including the apartment number that wasn't visible from the street. Someone had been watching her, learning her routines, studying her life. She tried her radio again, but it was still dead. Her cell phone showed the same no signal message. She was completely cut off from backup, alone in the dark with someone who knew more about her than they should. The smart thing would be to head back to the station, but Jessica had never been one to back down from a challenge. She was a cop, trained to handle dangerous situations, and she wasn't about to let some graffiti artist scare her off her beat. She decided to check the perimeter of the building where the second message had appeared. Maybe she could find some clue about who was responsible. A discarded spray can, footprints, anything that might lead her to the perpetrator. The alley behind the bookstore was narrow and dark, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes. Jessica moved carefully, her flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the pavement. The smell of garbage and urine was overwhelming, but she pressed on. Halfway down the alley, she found it. A fresh spray can, still warm to the touch, lying next to a pile of newspapers. The cap was missing, and red paint was still dripping from the nozzle. Whoever had been here couldn't have left more than a few minutes ago. Jessica looked around, searching for any sign of movement. The fire escapes above her creaked in the wind, and she could hear the distant sound of traffic from the main street. But there was something else. A soft, scratching sound, like fingernails on concrete. She followed the sound to a metal door at the far end of the alley. It was slightly ajar, and the scratching was coming from inside. Jessica approached carefully, her hand resting on her service weapon. "Portland Police," she announced. "I'm coming in." She pushed the door open and stepped into what appeared to be a storage room. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Cardboard boxes were stacked floor to ceiling, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like curtains. The scratching sound was louder now, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the building, past the storage room and into what looked like a larger space beyond. Jessica moved forward, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam illuminated a doorway ahead, and beyond it, she could see what appeared to be a large, open room. The scratching sound was definitely coming from there. She stepped through the doorway and found herself in what had once been a warehouse. The space was huge, with high ceilings and concrete floors. Moonlight streamed through dirty windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move and shift as she watched. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete that Jessica could hear her own heartbeat. She swept her flashlight across the room, looking for the source of the sound. In the far corner, she saw them. Words carved into the concrete wall. Not spray-painted this time, but actually carved, as if someone had spent hours scraping away at the surface with a knife or some other sharp instrument. The letters were deep and jagged, and they seemed to glow in the beam of her flashlight. Jessica moved closer, her pulse quickening. The words were repeated over and over, covering the entire wall from floor to ceiling. "Jessica Martinez is going to die tonight." The message was carved hundreds of times, in different sizes and at different angles, creating a manic collage of threat and obsession. Some of the letters were fresh, the concrete dust still white and powdery. Others looked older, worn smooth by time and the weather. Jessica backed away from the wall, her mouth dry with fear. This wasn't just graffiti or vandalism. This was something else entirely. Someone had been planning this for a long time, watching her, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. A sound behind her made her spin around. A figure stood in the doorway she had just come through. A man in dark clothing, his face hidden in shadow. He was tall and thin, with long arms that hung at his sides like a scarecrow. "You shouldn't have come here, Jessica," the man said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it. It sounded like he was speaking from very far away, or from underwater. Jessica drew her weapon, her training kicking in despite her fear. "Portland Police, put your hands where I can see them." The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think that toy is going to help you? You think your badge and your gun are going to save you?" "I said, put your hands up," Jessica repeated, her voice steady despite the terror that was clawing at her chest. The man began to move toward her, his movements strange and jerky like a puppet being controlled by an inexpert hand. As he stepped into the light, Jessica could see his face clearly for the first time. It wasn't quite human. The features were close. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. But they were wrong somehow. The proportions were off, the skin too pale, the eyes too large and dark. When he smiled, she could see that his teeth were filed to points. "I've been waiting for you, Jessica," he said, taking another step closer. "I've been watching you for so long, learning your routines, studying your habits. Did you know that you always check the same 3 blocks first? That you always stop at Murphy's Deli to look at the specials in the window, even though you never buy anything?" Jessica's finger tightened on the trigger. "Stay back. I'm warning you." "I know about your apartment on Hawthorne Street," the man continued, ignoring her warning. I know that you keep a spare key under the third flower pot from the left. I know that you sleep with the window open, even in winter. I know that you have nightmares about your father's death." Jessica's blood turned to ice. Her father had died in a car accident when she was 12, and she had never told anyone about the nightmares. How could this stranger know something so personal, so private? "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The man smiled wider, his pointed teeth gleaming in the flashlight beam. "I'm your shadow, Jessica. I'm the darkness that follows you wherever you go. I'm the fear that keeps you awake at night." He took another step closer, and Jessica could smell something wrong about him. A sickly, sweet odor, like flowers left too long in water. "I've been inside your apartment, Jessica. I've sat in your chair, slept in your bed, eaten your food. I've watched you shower, watched you sleep, watched you cry." "You're lying," Jessica said, but her voice was weak. She was thinking about the times she had felt like someone was watching her, the occasions when she had come home to find things slightly out of place, the mornings when she had woken up feeling like someone else had been in her bed. "Am I?" the man asked. "Check your service weapon, Jessica. Look at the bullets." Jessica's heart pounded as she ejected the magazine from her gun. The bullets were gone, replaced by what looked like small pieces of paper, rolled up tight. With shaking hands, she unrolled one of them. It was a photograph of her, taken through her bedroom window. She was asleep, her face peaceful in the moonlight. Written across the bottom in red ink were the words, "Soon, my love. Soon." Jessica looked up at the man, terror overwhelming her training. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand," he said, his voice becoming more urgent. "I want you to know what it feels like to be watched, to be hunted, to be afraid. Do you know how many people have called for your help, Jessica? How many times you've arrived too late?" Images flashed through Jessica's mind. Crime scenes she had worked, victims she had found, people she had failed to save. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had been beaten to death while Jessica was dealing with a noise complaint 6 blocks away. Tommy Rodriguez, the teenager who had bled out in an alley while Jessica was stuck in traffic. Sarah Williams, the young mother who had been murdered by her ex-husband while Jessica was on her lunch break. "Stop," Jessica whispered, but the images kept coming. "This is what they felt," the man said, his voice filling the warehouse. "This is the fear they experienced in their final moments, alone, helpless, knowing that help was supposed to come but never would." The carved words on the wall began to glow brighter, and Jessica realized that they weren't just threats, they were names. The names of everyone she had failed to save, carved over and over into the concrete like a memorial to her failures. "You're not real," Jessica said, her voice barely audible. "You can't be real." The man laughed again, and this time the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I'm as real as your guilt, Jessica. I'm as real as your fear. I'm as real as the knowledge that you will never be fast enough, never be good enough, never be able to save everyone who needs saving." The warehouse began to change around them. The walls grew higher, the ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the floor became an endless expanse of concrete. The names on the wall multiplied, spreading across every surface until they covered the entire space. Jessica ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away from the man, from the names, from the crushing weight of her own inadequacy. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space, but no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't seem to reach the exit. Behind her, she could hear the man laughing, the sound growing louder and more distorted with each step. "You can't run from yourself, Jessica. You can't run from the truth." Jessica's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, but the warehouse seemed to stretch on forever. The names on the walls began to whisper, each one calling out to her, reminding her of her failures. "Jessica, why didn't you save me?" whispered Mrs. Chen. "You were supposed to protect me," cried Tommy Rodriguez. "I trusted you," sobbed Sarah Williams. Jessica stumbled and fell, her hands scraping against the rough concrete. When she looked up, the man was standing over her, his dark eyes boring into her soul. "Do you see now?" he asked. "Do you understand?" "Understand what?" Jessica gasped. "That you're no different from them, that you're just another victim, waiting for help that will never come." The man reached down and touched Jessica's forehead with one long, cold finger. Images flooded her mind. Not memories of her failures, but visions of her future. She saw herself growing older, more cynical, more broken with each case she couldn't solve, each person she couldn't save. She saw herself drinking alone in her apartment, staring at the photos of victims she had failed. She saw herself eating her gun in a moment of despair, unable to carry the weight of her guilt any longer. "No," Jessica whispered. "That's not how it ends." "Isn't it?" the man asked. "Look around you, Jessica. Look at all the names, all the people you've failed, all the people you will fail. How long do you think you can carry that weight before it crushes you?" Jessica forced herself to stand, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. "I'm a cop. I save people. That's what I do." "Do you?" the man asked. "Or do you just arrive in time to clean up the mess?" The warehouse began to spin around them, the names on the walls blurring together into a kaleidoscope of guilt and accusation. Jessica closed her eyes, trying to block out the visions, but they were burned into her mind now. "I do my best," she said, her voice barely audible above the whispers of the dead. "Your best isn't good enough," the man replied. "It will never be good enough. There will always be more victims, more failures, more guilt, and eventually you'll join them." Jessica opened her eyes and looked at the man. For a moment, she saw not a monster, but a reflection of herself. Broken, haunted, consumed by the weight of responsibility that no single person should have to carry. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I will fail. Maybe I'll never be able to save everyone. But that doesn't mean I stop trying." The man's expression changed, the confidence wavering for just a moment. "You can't fight what you are, Jessica. You can't fight the truth." "Watch me," Jessica said, and she reached for her radio. It was working again. The static was gone, replaced by the familiar voice of dispatch. "Unit 23, what's your location?" "This is Unit 23, Jessica said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm at the old Morrison warehouse on 5th Street. I need backup immediately." The man started to laugh, but the sound was different now, weaker, more desperate. "It won't matter. Even if they come, even if they save you, you'll still be haunted by all the people you couldn't save." "Maybe," Jessica said, "but I'll also be proud of the ones I did save. And I'll keep trying to save more." The warehouse began to fade around them, the names on the walls growing dim. The man's form became less solid, more translucent. "This isn't over," he said, his voice fading. "I'll always be with you, Jessica. Every time you fail, every time you arrive too late, I'll be there to remind you." "I know," Jessica said, "but I won't let you win. I won't let you stop me from doing my job." The man smiled one last time, his pointed teeth glinting in the dying light. "We'll see, Jessica. We'll see." And then he was gone, leaving Jessica alone in the empty warehouse. The names on the walls had faded, but she could still see them in her mind. A reminder of the weight she carried, the responsibility she bore, the lives that depended on her doing her job well. She heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. Backup was coming, just as she had called for. She wasn't alone, and she never had been. The job was hard, the failures were real, but so were the successes. So were the lives she had saved, the people she had helped, the difference she had made. Jessica walked toward the exit, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Outside, she could see the flashing lights of patrol cars, the familiar silhouettes of her fellow officers. They had come for her, just as she would come for them. That was what cops did. They watched each other's backs. They answered each other's calls. They never let each other face the darkness alone. As she stepped out into the night, Jessica felt the weight of her responsibility settling on her shoulders again. It was heavy, but it was also a privilege. She was a guardian, a protector, a thin blue line between order and chaos. The man, whatever he had been, was wrong about one thing. She wasn't just another victim waiting for help that would never come. She was the help. She was the one who came running when others called. She was the one who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. And she would keep doing it, failures and all, until the day she died. Because that's what cops did. They served and protected, even when it cost them everything. Even when it broke them, even when it haunted them. They kept going because someone had to. And Jessica Martinez, officer of the Portland Police Department, would be one of them. The names would always be with her. Mrs. Chen, Tommy Rodriguez, Sarah Williams, and all the others. But so would the names of the people she had saved, the lives she had touched, the difference she had made. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't enough, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you could do. The sirens grew louder, and Jessica walked toward them, toward her backup, toward her duty. The night was dark, but she wasn't alone. She never had been. Officer Jessica Martinez returned to her beat 3 days later, after a mandatory psych evaluation and a brief administrative leave. The department psychologist had diagnosed her with acute stress reaction and recommended counseling, which she accepted. She didn't tell him about the warehouse, about the man with the pointed teeth, about the names carved into the walls. Some things were too strange to put in a report, too personal to share with a stranger. But she remembered. Every night when she walked her beat, she remembered. The man had been right about one thing. She would never be able to save everyone. People would die on her watch, and she would have to live with that knowledge. But she had also learned something else that night. The guilt and the fear and the weight of responsibility didn't have to destroy her. They could motivate her, drive her to be better, to try harder, to never give up. She started carrying a notebook with her, a small spiral-bound pad that she kept in her shirt pocket. In it, she wrote down the names of the people she helped, the lost tourists she gave directions to, the domestic violence victims she connected with shelters, the homeless people she checked on during cold nights. For every name that haunted her, she wanted to remember a name that gave her hope. The notebook filled up quickly. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman whose purse she had recovered from a thief. James Walker, the runaway teenager she had reunited with his family. Maria Santos, the assault victim she had driven to the hospital and stayed with until her sister arrived. The names of the saved began to outnumber the names of the lost, and Jessica found that the weight on her shoulders was easier to bear. She was still haunted by her failures, but she was also sustained by her successes. One night, about a month after the incident at the warehouse, Jessica was walking her beat when she saw him again. The man with the pointed teeth was standing in the shadows of an alley, watching her with his dark eyes. "Hello, Jessica," he said, his voice carrying the same underwater quality she remembered. "I told you I'd be back." Jessica stopped walking and looked at him directly. "I know you did." "Are you afraid?" he asked. Jessica considered the question. "Yes," she said finally, "but I'm not running." The man smiled, but it was different from before, less predatory, more curious. "Why not?" "Because I have work to do," Jessica said simply. "People to protect, lives to save, and people to fail," the man reminded her. "People to lose." "Yes," Jessica agreed. "That too. But I can't let the fear of failure stop me from trying." The man stepped closer, and Jessica could see that he was different somehow, less solid, more translucent. The names that had been carved into the warehouse walls were now carved into his skin, covering his arms and face like tattoos. "You're carrying us all with you," he said. "The living and the dead, the saved and the lost. How long do you think you can bear that weight?" Jessica touched the notebook in her pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of it. "As long as I have to." The man studied her for a long moment, his head tilted like a bird's. "You've changed." "So have you," Jessica observed. "You're not as scary as you used to be." The man laughed, but it was a sad sound now, not the terrifying cackle she remembered. "I'm not here to scare you anymore, Jessica. I'm here to remind you." "Remind me of what?" "That they're all still with you. The people you couldn't save. They're not angry, not vengeful. They're just there. Part of you now, part of your story." Jessica nodded. "I know. I carry them with me every day." "And the ones you did save?" Jessica smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "I carry them too. They're heavier somehow. More real." The man began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. "Remember us, Jessica. But don't let us destroy you. The world needs cops like you, ones who care enough to be haunted by their failures." "I will," Jessica promised. "I'll remember." The man nodded once, and then he was gone, leaving Jessica alone in the alley. But she didn't feel alone. She felt surrounded by the presence of everyone she had ever helped, everyone she had ever failed to help, everyone whose life she had touched in some way. The names were still there, carved into her memory like the words on the warehouse wall. But now they were joined by other names, happier names, names that reminded her why she had become a cop in the first place. Jessica continued her patrol, her hand resting on the notebook in her pocket. The night was dark, but she wasn't afraid. She had work to do, people to protect, lives to save, and she would keep doing it, one name at a time, one call at a time, one night at a time. Because that's what cops did. They remembered the dead, but they fought for the living. And Jessica Martinez, officer of the Portland Police Department, would never stop fighting. Officer Daniel Hayes had been working the graveyard shift in Millbrook for exactly 13 months when he first noticed the pattern. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something was wrong, a sense that the quiet suburban streets he patrolled held secrets darker than domestic disputes and teenagers drinking in the park. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves to those who know how to look, and Daniel had always been good at seeing what others missed. It started with the missing persons reports. Every month, like clockwork, someone would disappear from Millbrook. Always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on the third Tuesday of the month. Always someone who lived alone, someone who wouldn't be missed immediately. The department had noticed the pattern, of course, but the official line was that it was coincidence. A small town like Millbrook naturally had its share of people who simply moved away without telling anyone. But Daniel had done the math. In the 13 months since he'd started the graveyard shift, 16 people had vanished. The probability of that being random was astronomical. Someone was hunting in Millbrook, and they were very good at it. Tonight was the third Tuesday of November, and Daniel was determined to break the pattern. He had spent the past week studying the previous disappearances, mapping out the locations, looking for connections. The victims had all lived in different neighborhoods, worked different jobs, shopped at different stores. The only thing they had in common was that they had all been seen talking to a man in a dark blue sedan in the days before they vanished. Daniel had put out a BOLO for the sedan, but no one had reported seeing it. He was starting to think that maybe the witnesses had been mistaken, or that the car had been stolen and dumped somewhere after each incident. But he was determined to find it, to find him. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. Unit 7. We have a possible prowler at 1842 Maple Street. Elderly resident reports seeing someone in her backyard. Daniel grabbed the mic. Unit 7 responding. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald lived in a small house at the end of Maple Street, surrounded by tall hedges and mature oak trees. She was 83 years old, lived alone since her husband died 5 years ago, and had never called the police before tonight. Daniel parked in her driveway and approached the front door, his hand resting on his weapon. Mrs. Fitzgerald answered the door before he could knock. She was a small woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes, wearing a pink bathrobe and fuzzy slippers. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice shaking. "He's been out there for almost an hour." "Can you describe him, ma'am?" "Tall, wearing dark clothes. He keeps walking around the yard, looking at the windows. I think he's trying to find a way in." Daniel's pulse quickened. Mrs. Fitzgerald fit the profile perfectly. Elderly, alone, vulnerable. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, I need you to stay inside and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Be careful, young man. There's something wrong with him. The way he moves, it's not natural." Daniel checked his watch. It was 11:52 p.m. If the pattern held, the prowler would escalate soon. He drew his weapon and made his way around to the backyard, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The yard was empty, but Daniel could see footprints in the soft earth near the back door. Size 11 boots. Deep impressions that suggested someone heavy. The prints led to the window of what looked like a bedroom, then circled around to the kitchen window. Daniel followed the trail, his heart pounding. The prints led to the side gate, then stopped abruptly at the driveway. There, parked under a streetlight, was a dark blue sedan. The license plate was covered with mud, but Daniel could make out enough to run it. He called it in to dispatch, but the response made his blood run cold. The plate belonged to a car that had been reported stolen 3 weeks ago, the night before the last disappearance. Daniel approached the car carefully, his weapon drawn. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. He reached for the door handle, then stopped. Something was wrong. The car was too perfect, too obvious. It was like it had been placed there specifically for him to find. A sound behind him made him turn. A man was standing in the shadows of the hedge, watching him. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and baseball cap. His face was hidden in shadow, but Daniel could feel his eyes boring into him. "Police!" Daniel called out, raising his weapon. "Show me your hands." The man didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. Daniel took a step closer, his finger on the trigger. "I said, show me your hands." The man began to laugh, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "You're early, Officer Hayes. I wasn't expecting you for another hour." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The man knew his name. "Who are you?" "I'm disappointed," the man said, ignoring the question. "I thought you were smarter than this. I thought you had figured out the pattern." I did figure it out, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. You take someone every month, always the same night, always someone vulnerable. The man clapped slowly, mockingly. Very good, but you're missing the most important part. What's that? The man stepped out of the shadows, and Daniel could see his face clearly for the first time. It was ordinary, forgettable, the kind of face that would blend into a crowd. But his eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too knowing, like he could see right through Daniel's soul. The pattern isn't random, the man said. It's an invitation. Every month I leave clues. I make it just obvious enough that someone with half a brain could figure it out. And every month I wait to see if anyone will. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. What are you talking about? You're not the first cop to notice the pattern, Officer Hayes. Officer Morrison figured it out last year. Officer Kelly the year before that. They all came looking for me, just like you did, and they all became part of the pattern. The pieces clicked into place in Daniel's mind. Morrison and Kelly had both been reported as having moved away suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. But they had been cops, trained to handle dangerous situations. If they had really been investigating the disappearances... You killed them, Daniel said. The man smiled, and Daniel could see that his teeth were filed to points. I collect them. There's a difference. Collect them. I'm a hunter, Officer Hayes, but I don't hunt animals. I hunt the hunters, the people who are supposed to protect others, the people who think they're so smart, so brave, so capable of stopping me. Daniel's grip tightened on his weapon. You're insane. Am I? The man asked. Or am I just giving you what you want? You joined the police force to catch the bad guys, didn't you? To make a difference, to be a hero? I joined to help people. Bullshit, the man said, his voice sharp. You joined for the thrill, for the adrenaline rush of the chase, for the satisfaction of knowing that you're better than the criminals you hunt. Images flashed through Daniel's mind. Every arrest he had made, every case he had solved, every moment of satisfaction he had felt when he put the cuffs on a suspect. The man was right. There was a part of him that enjoyed the hunt, that thrived on the challenge of matching wits with dangerous people. You're wrong, Daniel said, but his voice was weak. Am I? And then why are you here, Officer Hayes? Why didn't you call for backup? Why didn't you follow procedure? Why are you standing in a dark yard with a serial killer playing exactly the game he wants you to play? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The man was right. He had been so focused on solving the case, on being the hero, that he had walked straight into a trap. I studied you, Officer Hayes, the man continued. I watched you for weeks before I started leaving clues. I learned your patterns, your habits, your weaknesses. I know that you're divorced, that you drink too much, that you hate working the graveyard shift but do it anyway because you think it makes you more of a real cop. Daniel's hand was shaking now, but he kept his weapon aimed at the man's chest. Shut up. I know that you have a hero complex, that you think you're the only one who can solve the case. That's why you're here alone, instead of with a partner. That's why you didn't call for backup. You wanted to be the one to catch me. I said shut up. The man laughed again, the sound echoing off the houses around them. You can't shoot me, Officer Hayes. You're a cop. You follow the rules. You need me to threaten you first, to give you justification. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. You are threatening me. You're a serial killer. You've murdered 16 people. Have I? The man asked. Can you prove that? Have you seen any bodies? Any evidence of actual murder? Daniel's mind raced. The man was right. All they had were missing persons reports. No bodies, no crime scenes, no physical evidence. Just people who had vanished without a trace. "Where are they?" Daniel demanded. "Where are the people you took?" The man gestured toward the sedan. "They're waiting for you, Officer Hayes. They're all waiting." Daniel looked at the car, and for the first time he noticed that the windows weren't just tinted. They were completely black, as if they had been painted from the inside. "What's in the car?" "Everyone who came before you," the man said. "Everyone who thought they could stop me. They're all there, waiting for the newest member of the collection." Daniel took a step back, his weapon still trained on the man. "You're lying." "Am I? Then go look. Open the car door and see for yourself." Daniel glanced at the sedan, then back at the man. "I'm not falling for your tricks." "It's not a trick," the man said. "It's a choice. You can walk away right now, call for backup, file a report. But you'll never solve the case. You'll never know what happened to all those people. You'll never be the hero you want to be. Or you can open the car door and see the truth. You can face the thing you've been hunting. You can be the cop you always wanted to be." Daniel felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to walk away, to call for backup, to follow procedure. But the man was right about one thing. He did want to be the hero. He did want to solve the case. He did want to know the truth. "What happens if I open the door?" he asked. The man's smile widened. "Then you become part of the collection, another hunter who got too close to his prey." Daniel's mind was racing. This was clearly a trap, but it was also his only chance to get answers. If he walked away now, the man would disappear, and the disappearances would continue. More people would vanish, and Daniel would have to live with the knowledge that he had had a chance to stop it and chose not to. "You're afraid," the man said, his voice mocking. "You're afraid of the truth." "I'm not afraid," Daniel said, but his voice was shaking. "Then prove it. Open the door." Daniel looked at the sedan again. The windows were like black mirrors, reflecting his own face back at him. He could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty, the desperate need to know what was inside. He took a step toward the car, his weapon still trained on the man. "If I do this, you'll tell me everything?" "I'll tell you everything," the man promised. "About the disappearances, about the pattern, about what happened to Officers Morrison and Kelly. Everything." Daniel reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. The metal was cold against his palm, colder than the November air. He looked back at the man, who was watching him with bright, expectant eyes. "Last chance to walk away," the man said. "Last chance to be just another cop who didn't have the courage to see the truth." Daniel's pride flared. He had never walked away from a challenge, never backed down from a fight. He was a cop, damn it. He was supposed to be brave, supposed to face danger head-on. He pulled the door handle. The door opened with a soft click, and Daniel peered inside. The car was empty except for a single manila folder on the passenger seat. He reached for it, his weapon still trained on the man. "Go ahead," the man said. "Open it." Daniel flipped open the folder with one hand, keeping his gun steady with the other. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same thing. People sitting in the back seat of the sedan, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Daniel recognized some of the faces. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who had vanished 2 months ago. Mr. Chen, the grocery store owner who had disappeared in September. Officer Morrison, his face frozen in an expression of disbelief and horror. "They're all here," the man said, his voice soft now, almost gentle. "Everyone who got too close. Everyone who thought they could stop me." Daniel looked up from the photographs, his face pale. "They're dead?" "Not dead," the man said. "Collected, preserved. They're all still here, in the space between moments. In the place where time stops and fear lives forever." The photographs in Daniel's hands began to move. The faces in the images turned toward him, their eyes tracking his movements. Their mouths opened and closed, as if they were trying to speak. "What the hell?" Daniel dropped the folder, and the photographs scattered across the ground. "Welcome to the collection, Officer Hayes," the man said, and his voice was different now, deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from everywhere at once. Daniel looked around and realized that the world had changed. The street was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. The houses had vanished, leaving only empty space that seemed to stretch on forever. The sedan was still there, but it was no longer blue. It was black, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Where are we?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're in the space between seconds," the man said. "The place where time stops, the place where I keep my collection." Daniel looked at the photographs on the ground. They were moving more actively now, the faces pressing against the surface of the images as if they were trying to break through. He could hear their voices, faint and distorted, calling out for help. "Let them go," Daniel said, raising his weapon. The man laughed, and the sound echoed in the empty space. "Let them go? But they're my greatest treasures. Each one a hunter who thought they could outwit me. Each one a reminder of my own superiority." "You're sick." "I'm efficient," the man corrected. "I take only what I need, and I preserve it perfectly. They'll never age, never die, never escape. They'll be with me forever, frozen in that perfect moment of realization when they understood that they had been outplayed." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to join them," the man said. "I want you to be the next addition to my collection. The next hunter who got too close to his prey." "I won't let you," Daniel said, tightening his grip on his weapon. "You don't have a choice," the man said. "You're already here. You're already part of the pattern. The only question is whether you'll go quietly or if you'll fight." Daniel looked around at the endless darkness, then at the photographs on the ground. The faces were all looking at him now, their eyes pleading, their mouths forming words he couldn't quite hear. "Fight," he said, and he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in the empty space, but the man didn't fall. The bullet passed through him as if he were made of smoke. He smiled, his pointed teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Physical weapons don't work here, Officer Hayes. This is my domain. Here, I make the rules." Daniel fired again, with the same result. The man didn't even flinch. "Then how do I stop you?" "You don't," the man said. "You accept your fate. You join the collection. You become another trophy in my endless gallery of the defeated." Daniel looked at the photographs again. The faces were becoming more agitated, pressing harder against the surface of the images. He could hear their voices more clearly now, and they were all saying the same thing. "Don't give up. Don't let him win." "No," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "I won't give up." The man's smile faltered. "You don't understand. You're trapped here. Time doesn't move. Space doesn't exist. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. There's only me and you and eternity." "Maybe," Daniel said, holstering his weapon. "But I'm not alone." He knelt down and picked up one of the photographs. The face inside, Officer Morrison, was looking at him with desperate hope. "You're all still here, aren't you? You're all still fighting." The man's expression changed from confidence to concern. "What are you doing?" Daniel picked up another photograph, then another. Each face was alive, aware, fighting against the prison of their trapped existence. You said you collect hunters. But you're wrong. You don't collect hunters, you collect fighters, people who refuse to give up, even when they're beaten. Stop, the man said, his voice urgent now. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, Daniel said, gathering more photographs. You feed on fear, on desperation, on the moment when people realize they've been outsmarted. But what happens when they stop being afraid? What happens when they start fighting back? The photographs in Daniel's hands began to glow, and the faces inside them were no longer pleading. They were angry, determined, ready to fight. This is impossible, the man said, backing away. They're trapped. They're powerless. They're not powerless, Daniel said, standing up with the photographs clutched in his hands. They're just waiting for someone to remind them that they're not alone. The darkness around them began to crack, like glass under pressure. Light leaked through the cracks, and with it came sound. Sirens in the distance, voices calling out, the sound of the real world beyond the prison of stopped time. No, the man said, his voice filled with panic. You're ruining everything. You don't understand what you're unleashing. I understand perfectly, Daniel said, as the photographs in his hands grew brighter. You're not some supernatural force. You're just a coward who preys on people's fear and isolation. But we're not isolated anymore. The faces in the photographs began to speak in unison, their voices combining into a chorus of defiance. We are the hunters. We are the protectors. We are the ones who stand between the innocent and the darkness. The man stumbled backward, his form becoming less solid. This isn't possible. I've held them for years, decades. They can't break free. They're not breaking free, Daniel said, understanding flooding through him. They're choosing to fight, together. The cracks in the darkness widened, and through them, Daniel could see the real world. Mrs. Fitzgerald's backyard, the street lights, the patrol car parked in the driveway. But more than that, he could see other police cars arriving, their lights flashing. Backup was coming. They can't see us, the man said desperately. We're outside of time. We're invisible to them. Not anymore, Daniel said, and he threw the photographs into the air. The images exploded into points of light, each one a soul that had been trapped in the man's collection. They swirled around the darkness like a tornado, their voices growing stronger, more determined. I am Officer Morrison, one voice said. I served and protected for 15 years before you took me. I am Officer Kelly, said another. I gave my life to stop people like you. I am Mrs. Patterson, said a third. I was a librarian who helped children learn to read. More voices joined the chorus, each one a person who had been stolen from their life, their purpose, their chance to make a difference. The man covered his ears, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. We are not your trophies, they said in unison. We are not your collection. We are people who lived, who loved, who mattered. The darkness began to collapse, folding in on itself like a house of cards. The man's form was flickering now, becoming transparent. You don't understand, he screamed. Without me, they'll be truly dead. At least in my collection, they exist forever. Existing isn't living, Daniel said. And living isn't about lasting forever. It's about making the time we have count. The lights swirled faster, and Daniel could feel their warmth, their strength, their determination. They were reaching out to him, not just the trapped souls, but the living world beyond. He could hear his radio crackling to life, could hear dispatch calling his name. Unit 7, what's your location? Officer Hayes, respond. Daniel grabbed his radio, and this time it worked. Unit 7 to dispatch. I'm at 1842 Maple Street. I need all available units for a possible 187 suspect in custody. Copy that, Unit 7. Units are en route. The man was fading rapidly now, his form becoming nothing more than a shadow. This isn't over, he said, his voice barely audible. There are others like me. Others who collect, who hunt, who prey on the hunters. Then we'll stop them too, Daniel said. All of us, together. The lights suddenly contracted, pulling together into a single brilliant point, and then exploded outward in a burst of pure illumination. Daniel felt himself falling, tumbling through space and time, until he hit solid ground with a jarring impact. He was lying on his back in Mrs. Fitzgerald's yard, staring up at the night sky. The stars were visible, twinkling peacefully, and the air smelled of autumn leaves and distant rain. He could hear sirens approaching, getting closer. Daniel sat up, his head spinning. The dark blue sedan was still there, but it was just a car now, stolen, abandoned, empty. The photographs were gone, but he could still feel their presence like a warm weight in his chest. "Officer Hayes," a voice called out. It was Sergeant Williams, running toward him with his weapon drawn. "What happened? Are you injured?" Daniel looked around the yard. Everything was normal. The hedges, the house, the street beyond. There was no sign of the man, no trace of the darkness that had trapped him. But he could still feel the echoes of the voices, the memory of their courage. "I'm okay," he said, getting to his feet. "The suspect fled, but I found his car. We need to process it for evidence." Over the next hour, more officers arrived. They searched the car and found it filled with personal items belonging to the missing people. Wallets, jewelry, photographs, driver's licenses. It was enough evidence to confirm that they had found their serial killer's vehicle, even if they hadn't found the man himself. But Daniel knew they wouldn't find him. The man, whatever he had been, was gone, defeated not by bullets or handcuffs, but by the collective will of his victims refusing to be forgotten. As the crime scene team processed the sedan, Daniel noticed something that made his heart skip. In the back seat, barely visible in the crevice between the cushions, was a small piece of paper. He palmed it quickly, making sure no one saw. Later, back at the station, he unfolded the paper in the privacy of the bathroom. It was a note, written in a shaky hand. "Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for not giving up. We're at peace now. Morrison, Kelly, and all the others." Daniel smiled, folding the note carefully and putting it in his wallet. He would keep it as a reminder, not of the horror he had faced, but of the strength he had found in unity, in the knowledge that no one had to face the darkness alone. The disappearances in Millbrook stopped after that night. The pattern was broken, the cycle ended. The man was never found, never identified, never brought to trial. But Daniel knew that justice had been served in a way that no court could have managed. He returned to his beat the next night, and the night after that. The graveyard shift didn't seem so lonely anymore. Every time he walked the empty streets, he could feel the presence of those who had come before him, not as ghosts or memories, but as partners in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, he could swear he heard their voices on the wind, reminding him that he was never truly alone. That somewhere in the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were still fighting alongside him. Officer Daniel Hayes continued to work the graveyard shift in Millbrook for 3 more years after the incident. He never spoke about what had really happened that night, but his fellow officers noticed changes in him. He was more confident, more decisive, more willing to trust his instincts. He had an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, to sense when something was wrong before it became obvious. His arrest record improved dramatically. He solved cases that had stumped other officers. found missing persons who had been given up for dead, and prevented crimes that might have otherwise gone undetected. His colleagues joked that he had developed a sixth sense, but Daniel knew the truth. He wasn't working alone. On quiet nights when the streets were empty and the city slept, Daniel would sometimes feel their presence. Morrison, Kelly, Mrs. Patterson, and all the others. They were no longer trapped in photographs or frozen in time. They were free, but they had chosen to stay, to help, to be part of something larger than themselves. They whispered warnings when danger approached, guided his steps when he was lost, and gave him strength when he faltered. They were his partners in the truest sense, fellow officers who had crossed the line between life and death, but hadn't forgotten their oath to serve and protect. Daniel learned to listen to their voices, to trust their guidance, to draw strength from their sacrifice. He became a legend in the department, the officer who always seemed to know where the trouble was, who could solve the unsolvable, who never gave up on a case. But he also learned to look for the signs, the patterns that indicated when someone like the man was operating in the shadows. He became an expert on serial predators, studied their methods, learned to recognize the subtle clues they left behind. He gave lectures at police academies, wrote articles for law enforcement journals, and consulted on cases across the country. Most importantly, he taught other officers to recognize the signs, to trust their instincts, to never ignore the voice that whispered warnings in the darkness. He couldn't tell them about the supernatural aspects of his experience, but he could share the practical knowledge he had gained. Trust your gut, he would tell rookie officers. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember, you're never really alone out there. Every officer who came before you, every one who fought the good fight, they're all with you in spirit. The rookies would nod, thinking he was being metaphorical. But Daniel knew better. He knew that in the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, the line between metaphor and reality was thinner than most people believed. On his last night working the graveyard shift, before his promotion to detective, Daniel made one final patrol through the streets of Millbrook. The town was peaceful, sleeping safely under the protection of officers who understood that their duty extended beyond the physical world. As he walked past Mrs. Fitzgerald's house, she had moved to a retirement community 6 months after the incident. Daniel felt a familiar presence beside him. He turned and saw the faint outline of a figure in a police uniform, transparent as morning mist, but undeniably real. "Morrison?" he said quietly. The figure nodded, and Daniel could see the badge on his chest, the same badge that Daniel wore with pride. "Time to move on, Hayes. But remember, we're always here if you need us." "I know," Daniel said. "Thank you. All of you." The figure smiled and began to fade, but not before Daniel heard one last whisper on the wind. "Serve and protect, brother. Always serve and protect." Daniel continued his walk, no longer feeling the weight of solitude on his shoulders. He had learned the most important lesson of police work, that the badge was more than a symbol, the uniform more than clothing. They were connections to something larger, something that transcended individual mortality. Every officer who had ever worn the badge, everyone who had ever stood between the innocent and the darkness, was part of an eternal brotherhood. They watched over each other, guided each other, and ensured that no one ever truly walked alone. As the sun rose over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Daniel Hayes completed his final graveyard shift. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, not through superior firepower or tactical skill, but through the simple recognition that courage was contagious, that hope was stronger than fear, and that the bonds forged in service to others could never be broken. The pattern was broken, the cycle was ended. The hunters had become the hunted, and justice had been served in a way that would echo through eternity. Officer Daniel Hayes had learned the most important truth of police work, that every officer who had ever worn the badge was still on duty, still serving, still protecting. Death was not the end of service. It was simply a different kind of patrol, in a different kind of beat. And in the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were all still there, watching over those who had chosen to carry on the fight. The graveyard shift never ended. It just changed hands, one officer at a time, one generation at a time, one act of courage at a time. And in Millbrook, a quiet suburb where nothing much ever happened, the streets were a little bit safer because of the officers who had learned to listen to the voices in the darkness, who had discovered that they were never truly alone, and who understood that the badge they wore connected them to something eternal and unbreakable. The hunt for predators continued, but now the hunters had learned the most important lesson of all, that the strength of the pack was the wolf, and the strength of the wolf was the pack. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they were eternal. And in the space between seconds, in the place where time stood still, the collection had become something new. Not a prison of trapped souls, but a brotherhood of eternal guardians, watching over those who had chosen to serve and protect. The pattern was broken. The cycle was ended. The darkness had been defeated by the simple power of unity, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of those who had sworn to serve and protect. Officer Daniel Hayes had learned the most important truth of all, that heroes never truly die. They just change uniforms, from blue to invisible, from temporal to eternal, from individual to collective. And in the quiet streets of Millbrook, where nothing much ever happened, the citizens slept safely under the protection of officers both living and dead, all united in the eternal mission to serve and protect. The graveyard shift continued, as it always had, as it always would. But now the officers who worked it knew that they were part of something larger, something that transcended mortality and connected them to every hero who had ever worn the badge. The hunt for justice never ended. It just evolved, adapted, and grew stronger with each generation of officers who learned to listen to the voices in the darkness and discovered that they were never truly alone. In the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were all still there, serving, protecting, and ensuring that the darkness would never again triumph over the light. The pattern was broken. The cycle was ended. The collection had become a brotherhood, and Officer Daniel Hayes, now Detective Daniel Hayes, carried that knowledge with him as he moved forward in his career, knowing that every case he solved, every person he helped, every moment of justice he delivered was supported by the invisible army of officers who had come before him. The graveyard shift never ended. It just changed hands, one officer at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of service at a time. And in the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook, where the citizens slept safely in their beds, the eternal patrol continued, watched over by guardians both visible and invisible, all united in the sacred mission to serve and protect. The darkness had been defeated. The light had won. And the brotherhood of the badge stretched from the world of the living to the realm of the eternal, ensuring that no officer would ever walk alone again. Officer Daniel Hayes had learned the most important lesson of police work, that the badge was more than a symbol, the uniform more than clothing, and the oath more than words. They were connections to something eternal, something that transcended mortality and united all who had chosen to serve. The graveyard shift continued, as it always had, as it always would. But now those who worked it knew that they were part of something larger, something that could never be broken, never be defeated, and never be forgotten. In the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were all still there, serving, protecting, and ensuring that the light would always triumph over the darkness. The hunt for justice never ended. It just evolved, one officer at a time, one generation at a time, one act of courage at a time, and in the quiet streets of Millbrook, where nothing much ever happened, the citizens slept peacefully under the protection of officers both living and dead, all united in the eternal mission to serve and protect. The pattern was broken. The cycle was ended. The collection had become a brotherhood, and the graveyard shift continued, forever and always, watched over by the eternal guardians who had learned that death was not the end of service, but simply a different kind of patrol and a different kind of beat. Officer Daniel Hayes had discovered the most important truth of all, that heroes never truly die. They just change uniforms from blue to invisible, from temporal to eternal, from individual to collective. And in the space between seconds, in the place where time stood still, the hunt for justice continued, supported by the unbreakable bonds of those who had sworn to serve and protect. The graveyard shift never ended. It just changed hands, one officer at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of service at a time. And in the quiet suburban streets where the citizens slept safely in their beds, the eternal patrol continued, ensuring that the darkness would never again triumph over the light. The brotherhood of the badge was eternal. The mission to serve and protect was unending, and the courage to face the darkness was passed from generation to generation, one officer at a time. Officer Daniel Hayes had learned the most important lesson of police work, that no one ever truly walks alone. In the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were all still, that they were part of something larger, something that could never be broken, never be defeated, and never be forgotten. In the quiet streets of Millbrook, where nothing much ever happened, the hunt for justice continued, watched over by guardians both visible and invisible, all united in the sacred mission to serve and protect. The pattern was broken. The cycle was ended. The collection had become a brotherhood. And Officer Daniel Hayes, now Detective Daniel Hayes, carried that knowledge with him as he moved forward in his career, knowing that every case he solved, every person he helped, every moment of justice he delivered was supported by the invisible army of officers who had come before him. The graveyard shift never ended. It just changed hands, one officer at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of service at a time. And in the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were all still there, serving, protecting, and ensuring that the light would always triumph over the darkness. The hunt for justice never ended. It just evolved, adapted, and grew stronger with each generation of officers who learned to listen to the voices in the darkness and discovered that they were never truly alone. Officer Daniel Hayes had learned the most important truth of all, that the badge was more than a symbol, the uniform more than clothing, and the oath more than words. They were connections to something eternal, something that transcended mortality and united all who had chosen to serve. The graveyard shift continued, as it always had, as it always would. But now, those who worked it knew that they were part of something larger, something that could never be broken, never be defeated, and never be forgotten. In the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook, where the citizens slept safely in their beds, the eternal patrol continued, watched over by guardians both visible and invisible, all united in the sacred mission to serve and protect. The darkness had been defeated. The light had won. And the brotherhood of the badge stretched from the world of the living to the realm of the eternal, ensuring that no officer would ever walk alone again. The pattern was broken. The cycle was ended. The collection had become a brotherhood. And the graveyard shift continued, forever and always, watched over by the eternal guardians who had learned that death was not the end of service, but simply a different kind of patrol in a different kind of beat. Officer Daniel Hayes had discovered the most important truth of all, that heroes never truly die. They just change uniforms from blue to invisible, from temporal to eternal, from individual to collective. And in the space between seconds, in the place where time stood still, the hunt for justice continued, supported by the unbreakable bonds of those who had sworn to serve and protect. The graveyard shift never ended. It just changed hands. One officer at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of service at a time. And in the quiet suburban streets where the citizens slept safely in their beds, the eternal patrol continued, ensuring that the darkness would never again triumph over the light. The brotherhood of the badge was eternal. The mission to serve and protect was unending, and the courage to face the darkness was passed from generation to generation, one officer at a time. Officer Daniel Hayes had learned the most important lesson of police work, that no one ever truly walks alone. In the space between moments, in the place where courage lived, they were all still there, serving, protecting, and ensuring that justice would always prevail. The graveyard shift continued, as it always had, as it always would. And those who worked it knew that they were part of something larger, something that could never be broken, never be defeated, and never be forgotten. In the quiet streets of Millbrook, where nothing much ever happened, the hunt for justice continued, watched over by guardians both visible and invisible, all united in the sacred mission to serve and protect. The pattern was broken. The cycle was ended. The collection had become a brotherhood, and Officer Daniel Hayes, now Detective Daniel Hayes, carried that knowledge with him as he moved forward in his career, knowing that every case he solved, every person he helped, every moment of justice he delivered was supported by the invisible army of officers who had come before him, who continued to serve even after death, who had transformed from individual warriors into an eternal collective dedicated to the protection of the innocent and the pursuit of justice. The graveyard shift never ended. It just changed hands, one officer at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of service at a time. And in the space between moments in the place where courage lived, they were all still there, serving, protecting, and ensuring that the light would always triumph over the darkness.